Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the coldest bedtime story in the North Atlantic. Into the 8, 9, sometimes 12 weeks a Viking-age sailor might spend sleeping on an open, undecked boat with no cabin, no stove, and no roof, on water that could kill an unprotected swimmer in under 30 minutes. We're talking about the Oseberg ship, built around the year 820 and later dragged into a burial mound as a queen's tomb. We're talking about a Norwegian merchant named Othere, who sailed farther north than almost anyone alive in the year 890 and lived to describe it to a king. And we're talking about a length of coarse wool cloth called vammel that may have done more to keep the Viking world afloat and alive than any sword ever did. Welcome to the deck of a longship at dusk, somewhere off a coastline with no name on any map yet, where the sun is going down, the temperature is dropping right behind it, and the only thing standing between you and the sea is a strip of oiled hide and the shoulder of the man sleeping 6 inches to your left. Go ahead and dim the lights. If you've got a fan, let it hum low and steady, a constant, even drone, like wind finding its way through rigging and wet wool. That sound isn't far off from what a Viking crew actually fell asleep to, night after night, week after week. You're warm right now. You're dry right now. Neither of those things was guaranteed on a boat like this one, and by the end of tonight, you'll understand exactly how thin that line really was. So get comfortable, get warm, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sky over the fjord is doing that thing it does in early autumn, somewhere around the year 950, going gold, then bruised purple, then a flat heavy grey that means the temperature is about to drop fast. You smell it before you see it. Wet wool, tar, brine, and the faint sourness of dried fish that's been packed too close to someone's boots for 3 days straight. That's the smell of a fully loaded Nar, the broad-bellied cargo ship that carried Norse settlers, traders, and their livestock across open water, and it is, whether you like it or not, about to become the smell you fall asleep to. Here's the thing nobody tells you about Viking-age sailing. There was no below decks. Not on the ships doing the real ocean crossings. A Nar or a langskip, a longship, was essentially a large, open wooden shell with a hold amidships for cargo, rowing benches or sea chests along the sides, and absolutely nothing you would recognise as a room. No hull, no hatch, no wall between you and the wind. When night fell on open water, you didn't retire to your quarters. You lay down roughly where you'd been sitting all day, because that's where the boat was. Meet Ketil. He's about 17, a free farmer's second son from somewhere near Sognefjord, and he's rowing this crossing not because he loves the sea, but because his older brother inherited the land and Ketil needed a way to make his own name, his own Åstra, the word fame that Norse society valued above almost everything else, since a dead man's reputation was the one thing that outlived him. Ketil has a small telling habit. He counts his oar strokes in sets of 100, then touches the hilt of his knife once, like a private ritual to mark the passage of time on a boat with no clocks. You notice it on the first afternoon, and you'll notice it every afternoon after, right up until the day it stops. Ketil's most valuable possession, other than that knife, is his fat. A sleeping sack stitched from cured animal hide, sometimes lined with fleece, that Old Norse sources mention specifically as sea travel gear, distinct from ordinary bedding. It is not a luxury. On an open boat with no fire, no walls, and nights that can drop below freezing even in a Norwegian summer, the fat is closer to survival equipment than furniture. And men who owned good ones were known to lend, sell, or fight over them. Ketil's is sealskin, oiled dark, and he keeps it rolled tight against a sea chest during the day so the wind can't find its way inside and undo whatever warmth it's holding. By early evening, the crew starts making its version of a bed, and here's where the mundane comfort of we're stopping to rest gets subverted fast. There is no stopping, not really, not on open water, and not always even close to shore. The ship's captain, usually the man who owns the vessel or commands it on a chieftain's behalf, makes the call on whether to beach for the night or press on, and the decision usually comes down to coastline, tide, and how much the crew trusts the weather. Tonight, with land 12 nautical miles off the starboard side and a falling barometer nobody can read, because barometers won't exist for another 700 years, the captain decides to keep sailing through the dark. That means no fire, no shelter beyond a canvas awning and a boat that keeps moving and rocking the entire night. Here's what that actually looks like. The crew rig a jawled, a tent cloth of heavy wool or hide, over a section of the ship using the mast, spare oars, or a dedicated ridgepole as a frame, turning about a third of the vessel into something resembling a low canvas lean-to. It won't keep out serious rain for long, and it does nothing for the cold radiating up off the water 6 inches under the hull planking, but it cuts the wind, and wind is the thing that actually kills you out here faster than low temperature alone. Kettle helps lash the jolt's corners to the sheer strake with rope made in no small part of walrus hide, a material so strong and so specifically prized for rope making that Othere of Hlogaland, a Norwegian trader we'll meet properly later tonight, told an English king it was one of the most valuable things his people hunted for. By full dark, the crew arranges itself along the sea chests that double as both storage and seating, a detail supported by the archaeology of ships like the Gokstad find. Excavated in 1880, whose rowing benches and chest placements suggest crew routinely used them as combination seat, footlocker, and sleeping platform. You lie down along the chest line, knees bent because there's rarely room to stretch out fully, your fat or wool cloak pulled tight, and the man next to you close enough that his breathing becomes part of the ambient noise of the ship, right alongside the water and the creak of the strakes. This isn't intimacy, it's thermodynamics. 2 or 3 bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder under shared wool-retain heat that one body alone simply cannot, and crews who understood this, even without the physics vocabulary for it, survived nights that solitary sleepers didn't. Here's the part that never makes it into the romantic version of this story. Someone is always awake. Sea travel in an era with no running lights, no charts in the modern sense, and coastlines studded with rocks that could open a hull in seconds meant a rotating watch was non-negotiable, fair weather or foul. Kettle pulls the second watch tonight. From roughly midnight until what the crew estimates, by the stars and the slow wheel of the sky, to be around 3 in the morning, he stands, or more often crouches, bracing against the sheer strake, scanning a horizon he can barely see, listening for the sound of surf that would mean rocks closer than anyone wants, and trying not to think about how cold his feet have become inside boots that have been wet since yesterday afternoon. Around midnight the wind shifts, and with it comes a fine, persistent rain that the jewelled cloth manages to mostly redirect rather than stop. This is the moment the whole night quietly turns dangerous. Wet wool, contrary to popular modern assumption, does still retain a meaningful amount of its insulating property compared to wet cotton, but meaningful is not the same as sufficient, and a crew member soaked through and exposed to a stiff breeze on open water is now facing the specific, well-documented threat of hypothermia, a condition medieval sailors had no name for, but plenty of first-hand experience with. Old Norse legal and saga sources describe drownings and deaths at sea often enough that risk to sailors was treated as an ordinary expected cost of the voyage. Not an exceptional tragedy, which, when you sit with it, is its own kind of quiet horror. This is where Ketil's fat becomes more than a sleeping sack. Beside him, an older man named Skeggi, a hired hand, not kin, brought aboard for this single voyage in exchange for a share of whatever profit the trading run produces, has no hide bag of his own, only a soaked wool cloak that's doing him almost no good at all. You watch Kettle, without a word, without ceremony, shift over and open one side of the fat, offering Skeggi half the shelter of it. It isn't generosity in the storybook sense. It's the practical, unsentimental math of a crew that understands a dead hired hand helps no one reach Iceland, and a live one might row tomorrow. But it is also, undeniably, kindness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't get written into a saga, and matters enormously to the 2 men it's keeping alive tonight. What happens if that math fails is a different matter. But that's not yet. Right now, the more immediate problem is your own body. Because you are, in this scenario, not much better equipped than Skeggy. Congratulations, you've been assigned a spot near the stern, close to the steering oar, which sounds like a position of importance until you realise it also means you're catching spray every time the ship's bow drops into a trough. Your wool cloak, and it is wool, because wool was, without exaggeration, the dominant survival textile of the entire Viking world, has been treated with lanolin, the natural grease still present in unwashed sheep's wool, which gives it a degree of water resistance that modern synthetic fleece, for all its technology, still struggles to fully replicate. It helps. It does not solve the problem. By 2 a.m, you are damp, cold, and doing the same thing every person on this boat is doing, which is trying to fall asleep anyway, because tomorrow there will be oars to pull, regardless of how tonight went. Here's the thing about Viking Age sleep that modern minds tend to miss entirely. It wasn't expected to be restful in the way we define the word. Sleep on an open crossing was closer to a biological necessity being grudgingly permitted between shifts of labour and vigilance than it was a restorative ritual. Fragmented, interrupted, cold, and shared with strangers, and yet it worked, in the sense that Norse sailors completed voyages of genuinely staggering length using exactly this method, again and again, for roughly 3 centuries. That's not a small footnote. That's the entire logistical backbone of the Viking Age, built on people's ability to tolerate exactly the kind of night you're imagining right now. By your 3rd or 4th hour of half-sleep, the rain finally eases and something shifts in the boat's motion, the wind steadying into a long, even push that tells the more experienced hands the worst of tonight has probably passed. You don't fully wake for this. It registers the way background sound registers, a change absorbed rather than noticed, and your body, exhausted enough to stop fighting the cold quite so hard, finally drops into something closer to real sleep. This is the closest thing to comfort you'll get tonight, and it isn't much. But, on a boat like this, not much is often the entire margin between exhaustion and something worse, and tonight, it's enough. Dawn on the North Sea does not arrive gently. It arrives as a grey seam along the horizon that slowly, grudgingly, admits there's a sun behind it somewhere, and it brings with it a specific miserable detail that every Viking Age sailor would have recognised instantly: hoarfrost. A thin crust of frozen dew clinging to every exposed rope, oar handle and strand of wool aboard the ship. You wake, if you can call it waking, when you are never fully asleep, to the sound of the crew shaking frost off their cloaks, blowing into cupped hands, and someone, somewhere near the bow, laughing at something that probably wasn't funny except in the specific way exhaustion makes everything funny. Ketil is already sitting up, counting something under his breath. Oar strokes from yesterday, maybe, or just a habit that steadies him. Skeggy hands back the shared half of the fat without comment, the way you'd return a borrowed tool, and the crew begins, wordlessly and almost automatically, preparing to do the entire thing again tonight. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Nobody on this ship expects sympathy for any of this, because everybody on this ship is doing it together, and because the alternative, staying home, never taking the risk, carried its own kind of cost in a society where reputation, land and opportunity were often won at sea or not at all. That doesn't make the cold less cold. It just means the crew has built an entire social framework around enduring it, one with real, documented structure behind it. Norse crews weren't bound together by sentimental village warmth. They were often strangers to each other before the voyage began, brought together by a ship's owner, a trading agreement, or a chieftain's call to arms, and held together instead by oath, by the promise of a fair division of whatever the voyage produced, and by Drengskappa, a Norse concept of courage, generosity and reliability that functioned almost like a reputational currency. A man who slept badly and rode worse for it wasn't just uncomfortable. He was, in the eyes of a crew that depended on him, failing a standard that mattered. The maddening thing about all of this, and this is the detail that tends to surprise people most, is how routinely survivable it actually was, provided the gear held and the weather cooperated. The crossing from western Norway to Iceland, a run of roughly 600 to 700 nautical miles across some of the most unpredictable water in the North Atlantic, could be completed in as few as 7 to 10 days with a strong, steady following wind, according to the general sailing performance historians have reconstructed from replica voyages and saga-era travel accounts. 10 days of exactly the kind of night you just spent aboard this Nar. 10 days without a bed, a wall, or a fire, repeated until the coastline of a new country finally showed up on the horizon, assuming the wind cooperated, which, this being the North Atlantic, it very often did not. And when it didn't cooperate, when a crossing stretched to 3 weeks instead of 1, or storms forced a ship far off its intended course, the margin for error narrowed fast. This is not speculation. Iceland's own settlement era records describe ships that simply never arrived, and further east, a set of roughly 26 memorial stones raised in Sweden, now known collectively as the Ingvar runestones, commemorate men who died on a single long voyage eastward in the 1040s, their names carved into granite by families who never got a body to bury. Sea travel in this era wasn't dangerous the way a modern flight delay is dangerous. It was dangerous the way it sounds when you say it plainly. People did not always come home, and everyone climbing aboard a Nar at dusk understood that, filed it away, and slept anyway, because the alternative was staying ashore forever. And that was never really an option for a culture built as thoroughly around the sea as this one was. By the time the sun fully clears the horizon, and the crew starts passing around whatever's left of yesterday's dried fish and hard bread, the night you just lived through has already folded itself into the unremarkable rhythm of the voyage. One more cold, wet, half-sleeping stretch of hours, indistinguishable, to this crew, from the one before it or the one still to come. That's the real quiet strangeness of it. What reads to you right now as an ordeal was, to Ketil and Skeggi and the dozen other men aboard this Nar, simply Tuesday. And somehow, across roughly 3 centuries of exactly this, 3 centuries of open boats, wet wool, and shared hide sacks, an entire seafaring civilization got where it was going. There's one more piece of tonight worth knowing before you leave this ship behind. The sheer physical strangeness of sleeping in a hull with no fixed floor beneath you. You're not lying on solid ground, you're lying on a curved wooden shell, riding waves that never fully stop moving. Which means your body spends the entire night making tiny, constant, unconscious adjustments just to stay in place. A kind of full-body vigilance that never really switches off, even in sleep. Combine that with the low, ever-present risk of seasickness, a condition Norse sources don't dwell on much, but which any modern sailor will tell you is brutally common on small open boats in choppy water, and you start to understand why restful is simply the wrong word for what happened on this deck at night. It wasn't rest. It was recovery, grabbed in fragments, between the labour of rowing and the vigilance of staying alive. And someone, always, is doing the actual navigating through all of this, even in full dark, even with no instrument more sophisticated than experience and the sky. Norse sailors relied heavily on what's now called dead reckoning, tracking speed, heading, and elapsed time to estimate position, supplemented by close observation of stars, the pattern of ocean swells, and the behaviour of birds and marine life near landfall. There's a persistent, debated theory that Norse navigators also used a sunstone, a crystal capable of locating the sun's position through cloud cover via its light polarizing properties, a detail mentioned in later saga material. Modern researchers have tested calcite crystals for exactly this purpose with some promising results, but whether Viking Age sailors actually relied on the technique remains genuinely disputed among historians, not settled fact, so file it under intriguing rather than proven. What's not disputed is that someone on this ship, right now, half frozen and running on fragments of sleep, is doing math with the stars to make sure you wake up somewhere other than the bottom of the North Sea. That, if nothing else about tonight, deserves a moment of genuine wonder. By the time full morning arrives and the ship's captain calls for oars, the crew has already begun the small, practical rituals of resetting for another day, wringing out cloaks, checking the joled ropes for chaffé, counting heads to make sure everyone who went to sleep is still aboard. Kettle rolls his fat back into its tight bundle against the sea chest, the same motion he'll repeat tonight, and the night after that, for as many nights as this crossing takes. There's no ceremony to it, it's just the shape the day takes, over and over, until land finally appears, and that repetition. More than any single storm or close call is the real story of how Viking Age sailors survived nights like this one. Not through some secret trick that made the cold bearable, but through sheer, practiced, communal endurance, night after night after night, until the coast of a new country rose up out of the grey to meet them. There's one more layer to a night like this worth knowing before you leave this ship, and it has nothing to do with wool or hide at all. Norse mythology gave the sea its own presiding figure, Arn, a goddess associated in Eddaic sources with drowned sailors, said to catch the dead in a net and draw them down to her hall beneath the waves. Sailors reportedly carried small amounts of silver or gold specifically to have something to offer Ern if the worst happened, a kind of maritime insurance policy paid to a goddess rather than an underwriter, and certain superstitions travelled with the crew as automatically as their sea chests, don't whistle at night, since it was thought to summon wind you didn't want. Don't speak too casually of a safe crossing before it was actually finished, for fear of tempting exactly the fate you'd just described avoiding. None of this kept anyone dry or warm, but it gave a crew something almost as valuable on a night like this one, a shared ritual vocabulary for fear itself, a way of acknowledging the real danger of the water beneath the hull without letting that acknowledgement curdle into paralysis. Catil touches his knife hilt after every 100 strokes partly out of habit, and partly, if you ask him plainly, because a small private ritual against an indifferent sea beats no ritual at all. That ship you spent the night on didn't happen by accident, and neither did the fact that it could survive weather that would have swamped almost anything built anywhere else in Europe at the time. To understand why, you have to stop thinking about the crew for a moment and start thinking about the hull beneath them. In August of 1904, a Norwegian farmer's burial mound near the Oslofjord gave up something nobody excavating it fully expected to survive 900 years of Scandinavian clay, an entire ship, nearly intact, its timbers preserved by the very wet blue clay that should have destroyed them. The Oseberg ship, as it came to be known, had been built around the year 820, and then deliberately buried roughly a decade or two later as the funerary vessel for 2 women. One of them likely a figure of considerable status. What archaeologists lifted out of that mound over the following months wasn't just a grave good. It was essentially an intact blueprint for exactly how the Viking Age solved the problem of keeping human beings alive on open water. The same open water, the same wet wool, the same crowded sea chests you were lying among just a few minutes ago. This is the story of the ship, or rather the ship type, that made sleeping through a North Atlantic night even remotely survivable. And it starts with a decision every Norse shipbuilder made before a single plank was cut. There would be no below decks. No cabin, no hold sealed off from the weather, nothing resembling shelter in the way later European sailing ships would eventually provide. This wasn't an oversight or a failure of imagination. It was a trade-off. And understanding why the trade-off was made tells you almost everything about how these ships, and the people sleeping aboard them, actually functioned. The core of the design is something shipwrights call clinker construction, or lapstrake building, overlapping planks riveted together edge over edge, rather than butted flush the way most modern hulls are built. Clinker hulls are lighter than their smooth-sided equivalents, and crucially, they flex. A Viking Age ship's hull was never meant to be perfectly rigid. It was built to twist and bend slightly with the motion of the waves, distributing stress across the whole structure instead of concentrating it at fixed joints. That flexibility is a large part of why these ships could survive open ocean crossings that similarly sized rigid-hulled vessels of the era genuinely could not. It's also, unfortunately for anyone trying to sleep aboard one, exactly why the deck beneath you never stops subtly moving, even in calm water. The same engineering that kept the ship from breaking apart in a storm is the engineering that made a perfectly still night's sleep essentially impossible. Shallow draft was the second non-negotiable design choice, and this one mattered as much for nighttime survival as anything else in the whole ship. A Viking longship or Nar typically drew only a few feet of water even fully loaded. The Gokstad ship, discovered near Sandefjord in 1880 and dated to roughly 890, drew only about 3 feet despite being nearly 76 feet long. That shallow draft meant a crew wasn't strictly locked into open water once night fell. Where the coastline allowed it, ships could be run directly up onto a beach, keel grinding into sand or shingle, giving the crew solid, unmoving ground to sleep on instead of a rolling deck. It's a small-sounding detail with an enormous practical payoff. The difference between a night spent bracing against constant motion and a night spent flat on the earth. And it's a large part of why so much of Viking Age sailing hugged coastlines whenever the route allowed it, rather than striking boldly out across open water the way the popular imagination often assumes. Here's the thing about that trade-off though, it only worked for coastal or short hop voyages. The truly long open water crossings, Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, and eventually the run toward Vinland, offered no convenient beach halfway across the North Atlantic. On those routes, the shallow draft that made beaching possible near shore became irrelevant, and crews were committed to exactly the kind of night you experienced earlier: open water, no ground beneath the hull, motion that never stops. The ship's design didn't eliminate that problem. It simply gave crews the option to avoid it whenever geography cooperated, and forced them to endure it whenever it didn't. The sail deserves its own moment here, because it's easy to picture Viking ships as purely oar-powered, and that picture is wrong for most of the era's serious long-distance voyaging. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Norse shipbuilders had adopted the square sail, typically woven from wool, not the flax or hemp more commonly used in the Mediterranean world, and treated with animal fat or tar for water resistance. A square sail meant a ship could travel enormous distances without a single oar stroke, provided the wind cooperated, which fundamentally changed the math of long crossings, fewer rowers needed, more room for cargo, passengers, livestock, and yes, sleeping bodies. The wool sail itself, incidentally, was made from the exact same coarse cloth, vammel, that clothed the crew and stuffed their sleeping sacks, meaning a Viking ship was, in a very real sense, wrapped from mast to hull in the same material keeping its crew alive. Picture that, the ship's engine and the crew's blankets cut from the same bolt of cloth. 60 years after Gokstad, in 1957, a set of 5 ships was discovered deliberately scuttled in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, apparently sunk sometime in the 11th century to block a narrow channel and defend the harbour from seaborne attack. Excavated in 1962 and now known as the Skulderlev ships, they turned out to represent 5 genuinely different vessel types: a small fishing boat, a coastal trader, a large ocean-going cargo ship, and 2 distinct classes of longship, one a smaller regional warship, and one Skulderlev II, a genuinely massive ocean-going vessel whose timbers, dated through tree ring analysis, trace back to the Dublin area around 1042. That single discovery did more to correct popular misconceptions about Viking shipping than almost any other archaeological find, because it proved definitively that Viking ship was never one thing, it was an entire specialised fleet. Each type built for a different job, a different crew size, and, whether by design or necessity, a different set of sleeping conditions. Skulderlev I, the ocean-going cargo vessel among the 5, is generally considered the closest archaeological match to the type of Nar you spent last night aboard: broad-beamed, deep-bellied amidships for cargo, with open rowing and sleeping space fore and aft. It's roughly 50 feet long and 16 feet across at its widest, dimensions that sound spacious until you do the math on a crew of 6 to 8 men, their gear, trade goods, and often livestock, all sharing that same open hull. There was no dedicated sleeping area because there was no space to dedicate. Everyone slept where the cargo allowed them to, which on a bad night meant wedged between wool bales and a nervous seasick goat. The sea chest is worth pausing on specifically, because it's one of those small design decisions that quietly solved three problems at once. Archaeological evidence from ship burials, along with the layout of rowing benches recovered from finds like Gokstad, strongly suggests that Norse crew members' personal chests doubled as their rowing seats during the day. At night, that same chest became a sleeping platform, a slightly raised, marginally drier surface to lie on than the bare hull planking, which was often sitting in several inches of bilge water that had to be bailed regularly regardless of weather. One object, storage, seating and bed, in a boat with no room to spare for anything that only did one job. It's the Viking Age equivalent of furniture that has to be a sofa, a filing cabinet, and a guest room all at once, and it says something about how tightly optimized these ships had to be, that even something as basic as where you keep your spare clothes was engineered to also solve the problem of where you're going to sleep. Not everything about sleeping aboard these ships comes from Norse sources themselves. One of the most vivid outside accounts of Norse maritime life comes from Ahmed ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and writer who travelled among Volga Rus, Norse traders and settlers active along the Volga River around the year 921 or 922. Recording his observations for his own government back in Baghdad, Ibn Fadlan describes, among other things, Norse merchants camped beside their ships, sleeping in the open near communal fires when shore camps allowed it. And he notes their physical robustness with something between admiration and bafflement. Men who tolerated cold and exposure that visibly troubled him. An outside observer coming from a very different climate. It's a useful reminder that the endurance this chapter keeps circling back to wasn't just a modern historian's assumption. It was something contemporaries from entirely different cultures noticed and wrote down, unprompted, because it genuinely stood out to them. None of this stayed purely theoretical for modern researchers. Either, in 2004, a team in Roskilde, Denmark, completed a full-scale reconstruction of Skuldelev II, the large 11th century longship, naming it Havingston fra Glendalough, the sea stallion from Glendalough, built using period-accurate materials and techniques as closely as modern craftsmanship could manage. In 2007 and 2008, a volunteer crew of around 60 sailed that reconstruction from Roskilde to Dublin and back, deliberately living aboard under conditions modelled on the archaeological and textual evidence: open hull, minimal shelter, rotating watches, wool clothing, and nights spent exactly the way this chapter has been describing them. The voyage confirmed a great deal of what historians had inferred from artefacts alone, that the ships were seaworthy, that the crew arrangements worked, and that modern sailors, even prepared with contemporary knowledge of hypothermia and cold weather survival, still found the experience of sleeping aboard genuinely, memorably brutal. If trained 21st century volunteers with modern safety gear found it that hard, it's worth sitting for a moment with what it must have asked of a 17-year-old named Kettle with nothing but a sealskin bag and a knife he touched for luck. What the Urseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, and the Skuldelev fleet collectively prove, laid out side by side across nearly 2 centuries of Norse shipbuilding, is that there was never a single Viking ship solving a single problem. There was a whole family of vessels, each one a slightly different compromise between speed, cargo, crew size, and the very unglamorous, unavoidable question of where everyone was going to spend the night. The ships that let raiders strike fast and vanish were built differently from the ships that carried entire families and their livestock toward a new life in Iceland, and both were built differently again from the small coastal boats meant for a single day's fishing and a night at anchor close to home. But every single one of them, from the grandest longship to the humblest fishing boat, made the same fundamental bet that a hull light enough to cross oceans and flexible enough to survive storms was worth the cost of never giving its crew a single solid wall to sleep behind. For roughly 3 centuries, that bet kept paying off. One cold, damp, half-sleeping night at a time. The Oseberg Mound itself, before we leave it, offered one more detail worth carrying forward. Alongside the ship, the excavators recovered an extraordinary cache of textile equipment, loom weights, wool combs, and fragments of woven cloth, some of it depicting scenes of ships and processions. It's tempting, and probably not wrong, to read that as more than coincidence. A society that buried a ship with its dead also buried the tools that made the wool that clothed that ship's crew, wrapped its sail, and stuffed its sleeping sacks, as if the grave itself understood that a Viking ship was never just timber and rope. It was timber, rope, and wool, in roughly equal partnership, and none of the three could do its job without the other two. There's a particular kind of vertigo that sets in when you stand, or picture yourself standing, in front of the actual Oseberg ship today, housed since the 1920s in what's now the Museum of the Viking Age in Oslo, its restored timbers curving up into that unmistakable, impossibly elegant prow. It is, by any reasonable modern standard, a beautiful object. It is also, once you know what you know now, a survival machine, an 80-foot argument for exactly how little shelter a human being actually needs to cross an ocean, provided the wool is good, the crew is willing, and everyone accepts, without much complaint, that comfort was never really part of the design brief. That ship, and ships like it, didn't just carry cargo and warriors across open water. They carried entire families toward land they'd never seen, on voyages that could stretch from a single rough night to weeks of exactly the exposure you've been imagining tonight. What that actually looked like, hour by hour, for the people making that specific kind of crossing, is where this story goes next. Wait, one more piece of that ship deserves attention before we move on, because it explains something you experienced firsthand last night without necessarily clocking why it worked. Remember the jarl the tent cloth Catil helped lash down using the mast as a frame? That wasn't improvisation. The mast step, the reinforced socket where the mast slotted into the keelson, was one of the most structurally critical points on the entire ship, engineered to bear enormous load from the sail under full wind. By day, it anchored the sail that drove the ship forward. By night, with the sail struck and stowed, that same mast, sometimes paired with a spare oar or dedicated ridge pole, became the skeleton for whatever shelter the crew could rig. Shipbuilders weren't designing a separate camping system. They were designing one structural element to do the ship's most important daytime job, and its crew's most important nighttime job, without adding a single extra piece of timber. It's efficient in a way that would make a modern minimalist furniture designer proud, and it's also, when you think about it, a little bit sad. The entire concept of shelter for a Viking sailor was never a purpose-built thing. It was a repurposed piece of the machine that was already there. It's also worth clearing up a popular misconception while we're standing this close to the evidence. There was never one single Viking ship design, the way modern pop culture and more than a few museum gift shops tend to imply. Regional building traditions varied noticeably between Western Norway, Eastern Sweden and Denmark, with differences in hull shape, plank thickness, and rigging reflecting local timber availability, local water conditions, and the specific job a given ship needed to do. A ship built for raiding up shallow rivers in England looked and handled differently from one built for the deep, exposed crossing to Iceland, which looked and handled differently again from a coastal fishing boat that rarely left sight of land. What united them wasn't a single blueprint. It was a shared set of underlying principles: clinker construction, shallow draft where the mission allowed it, wool sails, and, running through every single variant, the same unglamorous, non-negotiable fact: nobody, regardless of ship type or region, was sleeping in a proper bed out there. The ship changed. The cold didn't. There's a final irony worth sitting with before this chapter closes, and it's this. The very feature that made these ships so seaworthy, their openness, their lack of a sealed deck, is also, structurally, the reason so many of them survive today for us to study at all. A fully decked cabin-enclosed hull tends to trap and hold water when it eventually sinks or is deliberately scuttled, accelerating decay from the inside out. An open hull like Skulderev 1 or the Oseberg ship, once waterlogged and settled into anoxic mud or clay, can paradoxically preserve remarkably well, sealed off from the oxygen that would otherwise let it rot. In other words, The same design that guaranteed every crew member a miserable, exposed night's sleep is a meaningful part of why. 1,000 years later, we can still stand in a museum in Oslo or Roskilde and look directly at the timbers those men slept on. It's not much comfort to Ketil, freezing under his tea-owl somewhere off the coast in the 9th century. But it's a strange kind of gift to us, made possible by exactly the discomfort this whole chapter has been describing. Keeping a clinker hull watertight was its own constant, unglamorous labour, and it depended once again on the same handful of raw materials this whole story keeps circling back to. The overlapping seams between planks were caulked with tarred wool or animal hair, packed tightly into the join and sealed with pine tar rendered from resinous wood, a process requiring regular maintenance, since the same flexing that let the hull survive storms also worked seams gradually looser over a long voyage. A ship's crew would have expected to recaulk sections of hull periodically, particularly after a hard crossing, and a ship left unattended too long risked the kind of slow, creeping leak that turned a merely uncomfortable night into a genuinely dangerous one. Crew members bailing not as a background task, but as the only thing standing between the boat and the bottom. It's a small, mostly invisible detail in the popular imagination of Viking ships, but tarred wool packed into a wooden seam is quite literally one more place this culture's signature material shows up holding a boat and its crew together. Crew size varied enormously depending on ship type, and that variation mattered enormously for how crowded, or comparatively spacious, a given night's sleeping arrangement actually was. A large longship built for raiding, like the reconstructed Skulderlev II, could carry a crew estimated at somewhere between 60 and 70 men, packed along rowing benches with barely enough space between them to lie down without overlapping a neighbour. A Nar on a trading or settlement run, by contrast, typically carried a much smaller crew, often as few as 6 to 8 adults, plus whatever family or livestock came along for a settlement voyage like stars, meaning proportionally more deck space per person, even if the boat itself was often not much larger overall. That's part of why the two ship types produced such different nightly experiences. More bodies sharing warmth on a crowded longship against a Nar's smaller, family-oriented crew, relying more heavily on gear like Ketil's fat to make up the thermal difference a crowd would otherwise provide for free. One more practical detail rounds out the picture of what these ships demanded to keep running. The oars themselves, along with spare planking, extra rope and repair materials, had to travel with the ship on any serious voyage, since there was no roadside assistance waiting anywhere on the open Atlantic. A broken oar or a split plank hundreds of miles from the nearest known harbour meant either a skilled crew member effecting a repair with whatever raw material and tools were aboard, or the whole voyage's safety margin narrowing considerably. Shipwrights and experienced sailors alike understood this, which is part of why crews so often included at least one person with genuine woodworking skill beyond ordinary sailing competence. One more specialised role, alongside the healer and the navigator, quietly essential to a voyage's survival. And one more reason a Viking ship's crew was never simply a collection of rowers, but a small, interdependent working team, each member's skill a load-bearing part of the whole system. That same open, undecked design carried more than trade goods and warriors across the water. It carried entire households, men, women, children, livestock, and everything a family owned. Toward land nobody in the crew had ever personally seen. On voyages that stretched the single rough night you just survived into weeks of exactly that exposure, over and over, until a coastline finally appeared. What that actually looked like, checkpoint by checkpoint, for the people making that specific and much longer kind of crossing, is where tonight's story goes next. The smell hits you first, again, but it's a different smell than the trading run from earlier tonight. This time it's manure, warm and close, mixed with brine and the particular sourness of nervous livestock. You're aboard a Nar bound for Iceland sometime in the 870s, and this is not a quick trading hop. This is a settlement voyage, one of the thousands that historians estimate carried the first wave of Norse colonists to Iceland in the decades following roughly 874, according to the later written but broadly corroborated Icelandic settlement record, known as Landenmap. That means this ship isn't just carrying you and a crew. It's carrying a household, tools, seed grain, timber for a longhouse that doesn't exist yet, and livestock, in this case 3 sheep and a nervous seasick milk cow, lashed into a narrow pen amidships, taking up space that would otherwise belong to sleeping crew. Travelling with you is Star, a woman in her late 20s relocating her entire family, husband, 2 young children, and an elderly mother-in-law who insisted on coming despite everyone's polite attempts to talk her out of it. Star's habit, the small human detail that marks her out over the coming days, is that she sings very quietly, almost under her breath, whenever the children are frightened. Old verse forms rather than full songs, the kind of half-remembered fragments a parent reaches for automatically. You'll hear it more than once before this crossing ends, usually at exactly the moments you need distracting from something worse. By the second day out of Norway, the mundane discomfort of a crowded, livestock-heavy boat has fully given way to something worse. Seasickness, spreading through both passengers and animals with equal indifference to status. The cow, panicked and unsteady on a pitching deck, has to be forcibly restrained twice to keep her from breaking her pen and injuring someone. You are, at this point, sharing your sleeping space not just with strangers and their belongings, but with the smell, sound, an occasional splash of a genuinely miserable barnyard, and there is, quite literally, nowhere on this ship to escape it. Here's the thing nobody warns you about settlement voyages specifically. It's not just harder than the trading run. It's harder in ways that have nothing to do with weather at all. By the 4th night, the weather turns, and this time it's not the manageable drizzle from before. This is a genuine North Atlantic squall, wind screaming across open water, and waves cresting high enough that the crew abandons any pretense of sleep and turns fully to bailing, securing cargo, and keeping the livestock from panicking hard enough to capsize their own pen. Star wedges herself and both children into the narrowest, lowest gap she can find between 2 sea chests, one arm braced against the hull, singing louder now, not softer. Because the point isn't to be quiet anymore, it's to be heard over the wind. You spend this night doing what everyone aboard is doing, holding on, bailing when told to, and trusting a hull you watched a shipbuilder describe, only a chapter ago, as engineered specifically to flex rather than break under exactly this kind of stress. A week out from Norway, with the storm behind you and the weather settling into a grinding, monotonous grey, the crossing has developed its own bleak rhythm, one you now recognise from experience. Rationing has tightened. Fresh water, carried in wooden casks and animal skin containers, is measured carefully by the ship's captain, because there's no way to replenish it mid-crossing, and a family's entire water supply for the rest of the voyage depends on getting the math right on day 1. Dried fish, hard flatbread, and a thin cultured dairy product called skyer, still eaten in Iceland today, in a form its Viking Age settlers would likely recognise, make up most of what's left to eat. Nobody is starving. Everybody is hungry, in that low, constant background way that becomes just another part of the discomfort you've stopped consciously noticing, the same way you stopped consciously noticing the cold 3 days ago. Here's the thing about sleep on a voyage like this one, stretched across more than a week instead of a single night. It stops being an event and starts being a condition, something you exist inside rather than something that happens to you. You sleep in fragments whenever the workload and weather briefly allow it, in whatever position the crowded, livestock-adjacent deck offers, and your body has slowly recalibrated what counts as enough. 4 broken hours now register, subjectively, as a decent night. This is not healthy by any modern standard. It is, however, exactly the physiological adaptation that made voyages of this length possible at all, and it's worth pausing to note, nobody chose this because it was pleasant. They chose it because the alternative, not settling, not claiming land, not building the kind of independent household Icelandic settlement, offered free Norse farmers who often had limited prospects back home. mattered enough to make 3 weeks of exactly this worth enduring. By day 10, the first real sign of land arrives, and it isn't the coastline itself, it's the birds. Norse sailors, lacking any instrument capable of detecting land at a distance, relied heavily on observed behaviour, certain seabird species that don't range far from shore, drifting kelp and driftwood in the water, and a subtle shift in wave pattern as open ocean swell begins interacting with an unseen coastal shelf. The crew spots a raven released earlier that day, a detail the later sagas attach specifically to the story of Fylki Vilgarason, one of Iceland's earliest recorded Norse explorers, who reportedly used ravens released from the ship to help locate land, a technique historians treat as plausible practice dressed up with a bit of saga flourish rather than fully verified fact. Whether or not this particular crew is using birds quite so deliberately, the excitement is the same. Something out there suggests land, and after 10 days of exactly the sleep you've been enduring, that suggestion changes the entire mood of the ship in seconds. But before land actually resolves on the horizon, there's a quieter, harder moment worth sitting with, because it's the emotional centre of this whole crossing. 2 nights before the coastline appears, the elderly mother-in-law, the one who insisted on making this voyage despite her age and everyone's gentle objections, takes a turn for the worse. Exposure, poor circulation, and the sheer physical toll of more than a week without real shelter or warmth have caught up with her, and by the second morning she can no longer sit upright without help. There's no ship's surgeon aboard this small settlement vessel, only the crew's collective, limited knowledge of what to do for someone fading from cold and exhaustion. Wrap her in every dry layer of wool the ship can spare, keep her as close to the Jarl's partial shelter as possible, and take turns simply sitting with her, because on an open boat with nothing else to offer, presence is sometimes the only medicine available. Star sings to her the way she's been singing to the children all voyage, quieter now, and this time nobody tells her to stop or sing louder. This is the register the whole crossing has been building toward, without you fully noticing, not the storm, not the seasickness, but this, an ordinary act of care between family members, offered with nothing but wool, proximity, and a half-remembered verse. Because that was genuinely all there was to offer. She survives. Not every elderly or frail passenger on a settlement voyage did. Norse sources and later demographic estimates both suggest that migration voyages carried real, elevated risk for the very old, the very young, and anyone already in poor health. An Icelandic settlement-era burial evidence includes individuals whose remains show signs consistent with the kind of prolonged cold exposure this crossing represents. But this particular grandmother on this particular crossing makes it pale, weakened, and leaning heavily on her son's arm, but upright and breathing when the coastline of Iceland finally, unmistakably resolves out of the grey 2 mornings later. It's not a dramatic rescue. It's just wool, proximity and time, working exactly as well as they were ever going to. Landfall, when it finally comes, is almost anticlimactic after everything that led up to it. A low, dark line of coast, volcanic and largely treeless, utterly unlike the fjord country this family left behind. The crew works the ship carefully toward a sheltered inlet, watching for the kind of natural harbour that will let them beach safely. And somewhere in the process of securing the ship and beginning to unload 11 days' worth of livestock, cargo and exhausted family members, the specific misery of any single night aboard, the 4th night storm, the 9th night hunger, the grandmother's worst morning, starts to blur into something closer to a single. Continuous ordeal successfully survived rather than a string of individually terrible nights. That blurring, more than anything else, might be the real coping mechanism behind an entire era of ocean crossings, the mind's own quiet mercy of letting individual bad nights fade into a single completed journey, so that people could actually bring themselves to do it again. Worth knowing, once the ship is finally beached and the immediate crisis of the crossing has passed, this family's 11 days were not an isolated ordeal. Landenmac, compiled by Icelandic scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries from earlier oral tradition and now lost written sources, records the names of roughly 400 named primary settlers, credited with claiming land across Iceland during the main settlement period, conventionally dated from around 874 to 930. A number that historians generally treat as representing a much larger total population once families, dependents, and enslaved or indentured people travelling with them are factored in, with modern estimates for total settlement-era population ranging into the tens of thousands by the time the process was substantially complete. Every one of those people made a crossing that looked, in its broad strokes like the one you just lived through, open boat, shared wool, fragmented sleep, and whatever the North Atlantic decided to throw at them along the way. Starr's family is not a special case in this story. They're the median case, which is precisely what makes the ordinary details, the singing, the grandmother, the rationed water, worth taking seriously rather than treating as embellishment. There's a dry, almost funny irony sitting underneath all of this, if you're in the mood to find it. An entire nation's founding population essentially completed one of history's largest voluntary open boat migrations using, as its primary sleep system, a rolled-up hide bag and the collective willingness of strangers and family alike to lie shoulder to shoulder under wet wool for a week and a half at a stretch. Somewhere in that fact is the pirate-adjacent Norse world's version of a group camping trip that never really ends, except nobody's driving home afterward, and the tent, such as it is, becomes the whole rest of your life. It's worth pausing on who exactly made up a crew like this one, because Family Voyage undersells how mixed these ships actually were. Alongside Starr's household are 2 hired hands taken on for the crossing itself, paid in a share of goods rather than wages in the modern sense, and a young man travelling as what Norse sources sometimes describe as a bound or indentured worker. Not free in the way Starr or her husband are, but not chattel property either in every case, occupying a legal and social status that varied considerably across the Norse world and doesn't map cleanly onto any single modern category. He shares in the same wet wool, the same rationed water, and the same rotating watch as everyone else aboard, because a ship this size cannot afford the luxury of treating exhaustion or hypothermia as someone else's problem based on status. The sea, in this narrow and specific sense, was a genuine leveller. Cold reached the ship's owner and the ship's bound labourer with identical indifference, even if the life waiting for each of them on the far side of the crossing would look very different indeed. Pregnancy and childbirth at sea, while not the norm, weren't unheard of either. Icelandic saga tradition includes more than one account of children born during or immediately around a settlement voyage, their birth locations sometimes noted as a point of genuine pride within a family's history, a kind of origin story woven into how that lineage understood its own beginning. Nothing quite that dramatic happens aboard this particular ship, but the possibility hangs over every crossing like this one all the same. One more layer of risk stacked onto a voyage that already asked its passengers to sleep in the open, eat rationed food, and trust a hull built to flex rather than break. That so many of these voyages succeeded, children born mid-crossing and grandmothers carried through their worst mornings alike, says less about luck than it does about just how much margin Norse seafaring culture had quietly built into its ordinary, unremarkable expectations of what a person could endure. Keeping the livestock alive through 11 days at sea turns out to be its own quiet, constant labour, layered on top of everything else this crossing demands. The cow needs fresh water rationed carefully alongside the human passengers, and dried hay, carried specifically for this purpose, has to be portioned out in amounts calculated to last the expected length of the voyage with a margin for delay. A calculation that gets uncomfortably tight if a storm like the one on night 4 adds days onto the trip. Sheep tolerate the crossing somewhat better than cattle, better suited by nature to cramped, difficult conditions, but even they suffer, and Starr's husband spends a portion of nearly every day simply checking each animal for injury, since a leg broken by a sudden lurch of the deck means either an unplanned slaughter at sea or a liability nobody can afford once they reach land and need every animal they brought to start a new farm. You watch this labour happen around you, hour after hour, and understand gradually that this voyage isn't simply about getting people to Iceland. It's about getting an entire working farm there in one surviving piece, livestock included, because Iceland offers no existing herds to buy from once you arrive. Whatever you bring is what you start with. Here's the thing that separates this crossing from the trading run you experienced 2 chapters ago. Even though the physical discomforts are nearly identical, this voyage only goes one way. Ketil's crew, trading between Norway and established ports, could reasonably expect to sleep in their own beds again within a season or 2. Star's family cannot. Landenmac records the names of Iceland's earliest documented settlers, among them a man named Ingolfur Arnason, traditionally credited as the first permanent Norse settler, landing at a site he reportedly named Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, for the geothermal steam rising from the ground there, sometime around 874. Every family making this crossing in the decades following Ingolfur's landing understood themselves to be doing something categorically different from a trading run, leaving Norway, in most practical senses, for good. That knowledge changes the emotional weight of every hard night on this ship. The storm on night 4 wasn't just dangerous. It was, for a family that had already sold or abandoned nearly everything back home to make this voyage, potentially the difference between a new life and no life at all, with no safety net of a return trip if things went badly wrong. There's a specific kind of quiet endurance this crossing demands from the children aboard too, worth a moment of attention before this chapter moves on. Star's 2 children, ages roughly 5 and 8, spend most of the voyage wedged into whatever corner of the ship offers the best combination of shelter and proximity to their mother. And while Norse sources rarely dwell on childhood experience in any detail, the practical reality is easy enough to infer. Smaller bodies lose heat faster than adult ones. And a child too young to help with rowing or bailing has correspondingly less to occupy the long cold hours beyond huddling and waiting. This is likely part of why Star's quiet singing matters as much as it does. Not just comfort in the abstract, but a specific practical tool for keeping frightened, cold children calm enough to conserve the energy their smaller bodies need simply to stay warm. A small piece of applied childcare wisdom passed down the same way the sailing knowledge and woolworking skill aboard this ship were passed down, through observation and necessity rather than any written manual. Later Icelandic tradition, in sources like Landenmap, occasionally preserves small specific details about individual settlement voyages that help ground exactly this kind of experience in something more concrete than general inference. Various entries describe settlers naming features of the new landscape after events or hardships from their crossing, or after family members who didn't survive to see the new land, a practice suggesting that the voyage itself and its costs remained vividly present in how these families understood and named the world they were building. A cove named for a drowned relative, a hill named for the direction the ship first sighted land, small, permanent monuments to an ordeal that otherwise left no written record beyond a name on a map. Star's family, like so many others making this same crossing, would likely have carried some version of that same instinct forward into whatever land they finally claimed, not forgetting the crossing, but folding it, permanently, into the geography of the life that came after it. One more practical note about water itself, since it's easy to take for granted after everything else this crossing has demanded. Fresh water aboard a Norse ship was stored in wooden casks sealed with pitch, or in cured animal skin containers, and it soured relatively quickly in the warmth and motion of a moving ship, developing an unpleasant taste well before it became genuinely undrinkable. By day 8 or 9 of a crossing like this one, the water everyone's been rationing carefully has typically gone flat and faintly foul, and crews learn to simply accept the taste as part of the voyage rather than a warning sign, distinguishing carefully between water merely unpleasant and water actually spoiled enough to cause illness. It's one more small, unglamorous discomfort stacked on top of everything else Star's family endures, not dramatic enough for a saga to mention, but real enough that everyone aboard this ship would have recognised it instantly as simply part of what a long crossing tasted like, in every sense of the word. Small mercies mattered enormously on a crossing like this one, and it's worth naming one more before moving on: the crew's cautious optimism whenever dolphins or porpoises appeared alongside the ship, a sighting Norse sailors across multiple recorded traditions treated as a good omen, sometimes associated with following seas and fair weather ahead, whether or not the correlation held up to any real scrutiny. A pod of dolphins breaking the surface near the bow on the 9th morning does more for this crew's flagging morale than any amount of rational reassurance could. A small, genuinely delightful moment of wonder threaded through an otherwise grinding, uncomfortable stretch of days. By the time Starr's household has its first fire burning on Icelandic soil, turf and driftwood, since trees are scarce on this new island in a way they never were back in Norway, the crossing itself has already started fading into the kind of story a family tells for generations, rather than a memory anyone dwells on directly. That's not unique to settlement voyages, either, long before ordinary families were making this crossing by the hundreds. A much smaller number of individual Norse traders and explorers were pushing even further into genuinely uncharted colder water than Iceland ever represented, and one of them, remarkably, left behind an account detailed enough that we can still reconstruct almost exactly what his nights looked like, more than 11 centuries later. Somewhere north of the North Cape, in waters no Norse sailor is recorded as having charted before him, a merchant named Othere brings his ship in close to a barren, wind-scoured shore and gives the order to make camp for the night. There is no beach worth the name here, no sheltering fjord, nothing but rock, tundra, and a coastline that has been trending steadily colder for days. His crew hauls the ship as far up onto the shingle as the tide allows, rigs what shelter the wool and hide aboard can provide, and settles in for a night at a latitude so far north that, depending on the season, the sun may barely set at all, or may not properly rise. This is the story of Othere of Hlogaland, a real Norwegian trader whose account of his own voyages survives not through saga or legend, but through the words of an English king's scribe, and whose description of exactly this kind of night remains one of the single most valuable eyewitness sources historians have for what Viking Age Arctic sailing actually involved. Here's what makes Othere's story different from almost everything else in tonight's script. It isn't reconstructed from archaeology, or inferred from law codes, or filtered through a saga written 2 or 3 centuries after the fact. Sometime around the year 890, Othere travelled to the court of King Alfred the Great of Wessex, in what is now southern England, and gave a first-hand account of his homeland, his trading voyages, and a specific remarkable journey he'd made around the northern tip of Scandinavia. That account was recorded, evidently close to verbatim, as an inserted addition to an Old English translation of a Roman-era history text by Paulus Orosius, meaning Othere's own words, or something extremely close to them, have survived for over 1100 years, nested inside a completely unrelated piece of scholarly translation, because a 9th century English scribe apparently found a Norwegian merchant's travel stories too interesting to leave out. Othere describes himself in that account as living farther north than any other Norwegian, in a region called Hlogaland, roughly corresponding to the coast of northern Norway today, and as a man of considerable wealth by the standards of his community, though his wealth, notably, wasn't measured primarily in silver. He tells Alfred's scribe that he owned around 600 tame reindeer, along with cattle, sheep and pigs, and that much of his income came from tribute paid by the Sami people of the region in furs. Feathers, whalebone and ship's rope made from walrus hide and sealskin, the same tough, prized material Ketil's crew used to lash down their tjald earlier tonight. Walrus hide rope, in particular, Othere describes as being of exceptional quality, and it's easy to imagine why. Walrus hide is thick, dense, and remarkably resistant to the exact combination of salt water and constant flex that would fray a lesser rope within a single voyage. The voyage that matters most for tonight's purposes, though, is the one Othere describes taking specifically to explore how far north and east the land continued, a journey undertaken, in his own words as recorded by the scribe, largely out of curiosity about the geography itself, alongside the practical business of hunting walrus for their valuable ivory tusks and hide. He describes sailing north along the coast for 3 days before the land began curving eastward, then continuing east and eventually south for several more days, tracking a coastline that, at the time, was almost certainly unknown to any Norse sailor before him. There were no charts to consult, because no one had made this specific trip and lived to describe it in a way that reached the wider Norse or English world. Every night of that journey was, by definition, a night spent camped or anchored somewhere no European sailor had ever slept before, which strips away any comfort of precedent, any sense that people do this all the time and it's fine. Other's crew genuinely did not know what tomorrow's coastline would look like, or whether tonight's anchorage was safe by any standard other than their own on-the-spot judgment. Sleeping conditions on a voyage like this would have followed everything you've already learnt tonight, but compounded by latitude. Farther north means colder water, more unpredictable weather, and, depending on the season or fare made this specific run, which the account doesn't precisely pin down, the strong possibility of near-continuous daylight disrupting the crew's already fragile rest. Or, conversely, stretches of near-continuous darkness making navigation and camp making dramatically harder. Either extreme adds a layer of disorientation on top of the cold and the wet wool and the shared hide bags. A body's sense of when to sleep depends heavily on light cues, and a crew sailing at a latitude where the sun barely dips below the horizon in summer, or barely rises above it in the depths of winter, would have had to override that instinct almost entirely, sleeping on a schedule dictated by exhaustion and workload rather than anything resembling daylight. Other's account describes reaching a point where the coastline turned decisively south into what he calls a great river or estuary, almost certainly the White Sea. Based on modern geographic reconstruction of his route, where he encountered a people he refers to as the Bjormas, described as cultivated and settled, in contrast to the more nomadic Sami communities he'd traded with earlier along the route. He notes, carefully, that he did not dare go further inland among them uninvited. A small but telling detail, even a man wealthy and bold enough to sail into genuinely unmapped Arctic water understood the limits of what an unfamiliar coastline and unfamiliar people holding it might mean for a small exhausted crew a very long way from home. Caution here reads less like fear and more like the same unsentimental survival math that governed everything else about this voyage. There's a specific, quietly remarkable detail buried in Other's account that's easy to skip past. He mentions that the entire outward leg of this exploratory voyage, before he even reached the point of turning back, took as long as a whale hunter could normally sail in a month, under favourable wind, a phrasing that suggests he was consciously using a familiar, everyday unit of measurement, the length of a routine whaling trip, to help his royal audience grasp the scale of something well outside their own frame of reference. It's a small piece of rhetorical craftsmanship from a 9th century Norwegian trader, translating an almost unimaginable Arctic journey into terms an English king's household could actually picture. And it works, even now, a month's worth of exactly the nights you've been imagining all evening, sailed by men with no charts, no rescue option, and nothing but wool, hide, and each other's presence to get them through it. Here's the thing about why this account survived at all. When so much else from the period didn't, there wasn't a king, a warrior of legend, or a figure saga writers had any particular incentive to mythologize 2 centuries later. He was, by his own description, simply a wealthy merchant with reindeer herds and a habit of pushing his trading routes a little further than most people bothered to. His story got written down not because anyone thought it needed embellishing into legend, but because a scribe at an English court found a first-hand traveller's account, told in the traveller's own voice, genuinely worth preserving exactly as told. That plainness is precisely what makes it so valuable 11 centuries later. There's no obvious layer of saga-era dramatization sitting on top of it, the way there is with figures like Leif Erikson, whose story we'll get to shortly. What we have from Other reads less like legend and more like a transcript, and a transcript, however dry, tells you more about what an actual Arctic night at sea felt like than any amount of embellished heroism ever could. By the time Ortheri makes his final turn back toward Hlogaland, his ship, his crew, and presumably his walrus tusks and hide rope all still intact, he has completed a round trip into water no recorded Norse voyager before him had charted, sleeping every single night of it in exactly the exposed, wool-wrapped, watch-rotated conditions this entire script has been describing. He never frames it in the surviving account as heroic. He frames it mostly as a description of geography and trade routes, delivered matter-of-factly to a foreign king's household. Maybe that's the most striking thing about him, an ordinary Norwegian merchant treated an achievement that would headline any modern survival documentary as, essentially, a footnote to a longer conversation about reindeer herds and walrus tusks. For there, apparently, freezing on an open boat at the edge of the known Arctic world wasn't a story worth dwelling on. It was simply Tuesday, at a slightly higher latitude than most. There's a genuinely funny irony sitting at the centre of this whole episode. If funny is the right word for anything involving the 9th century, King Alfred the Great spent much of his reign fighting, negotiating with, and occasionally losing to Viking armies. The great heathen army had been carving up Anglo-Saxon England for the better part of 2 decades by the time Othère likely visited his court. And Alfred's own kingdom of Wessex had come close enough to collapse under Viking pressure that he'd reportedly spent time hiding out in the Somerset marshes at one particularly low point. And yet here, apparently unbothered by the broader political climate, is a Norwegian merchant sitting comfortably in the English king's hall, describing his reindeer herds and his walrus hunting trips in perfectly cordial detail, with no indication in the surviving text that anyone in the room found the situation especially awkward. It's the Viking Age equivalent of a heated rivalry existing at the national level, while individual business people from both sides keep quietly doing trade deals anyway. A reminder that the Vikings were never a single unified force with one shared agenda, but a huge, loosely connected network of independent traders, raiders, farmers and explorers whose relationships with the rest of Europe ranged from outright warfare to comfortable reindeer herd discussing hospitality, sometimes within the same decade. What Othere's account ultimately gives historians, beyond geography and trade routes, is a corrective to how easily the popular imagination collapses Viking sailor into a single archetype: the raider, the warrior, the figure standing at a longship's prow with an axe. Othere was none of those things, at least not in any account he gave of himself. He was a herdsman and merchant who happened to be curious enough, or ambitious enough, to push a trading voyage past the edge of what anyone else in his world had mapped, and who slept through every single night of that, pushed the same way every other sailor in tonight's script has slept, cold, exposed, and reliant on wool, hide, and the discipline of a rotating watch to see him through until morning. His story doesn't end in battle or legend. It ends in a quiet, plainly stated return home, and a conversation with a foreign king that somehow outlived both of them by more than 1,000 years. It's worth understanding exactly why anyone bothered mounting a voyage this dangerous in the first place, and the answer, as usual with the Viking Age, comes down partly to economics. Walrus ivory, sometimes called Morse ivory in later medieval European trade records, distinct from the elephant ivory reaching Europe through Mediterranean and later Islamic trade routes, commanded serious value across early medieval Europe, used for everything from carved religious objects to gaming pieces, and Norse traders operating out of northern Norway held something close to a regional monopoly on the supply during this period. Add walrus hide, prized specifically for rope making because of its unmatched tensile strength, and the walrus alone represented a genuine economic engine pulling merchants like Othère farther north and east than comfort, or common sense, might otherwise have carried them. Men didn't camp on that barren Arctic shingle for the scenery. They camped there because a single successful hunting and trading run could fund a household's wealth for years, and because the profit, in the end, was judged worth the specific, well-understood cost of exactly the nights this chapter keeps circling back to. There's also a physical toll to a journey like this one that Othere's account doesn't dwell on directly, but that any modern understanding of prolonged Arctic cold exposure makes reasonably easy to infer: frostbite risk to exposed extremities, chapped and cracked skin from constant salt water and wind exposure, and the slow, cumulative fatigue of weeks spent never fully warm or fully rested. Norse medical understanding of the period had no formal theory of hypothermia or frostbite in the clinical sense, but practical, hard-won knowledge of how to manage both almost certainly existed within a crew this experienced. Layering wool strategically, keeping hands and feet moving during watch duty, and recognizing the early, dangerous drowsiness that prolonged cold exposure produces as a warning sign rather than simple tiredness. None of that made the voyage comfortable. It just made it survivable, which, across 3 centuries of exactly this kind of sailing, turned out to be the only bar Norse seafaring culture was ever really trying to clear. Other's account, as recorded by Alfred Scribe, doesn't stop at the Arctic voyage. He also describes a very different kind of trip he made regularly, sailing south from his home in Logaland to a trading centre he calls Skiringsal, likely near modern Kaupang in southern Norway, and from there onward to Hedeby, a major Norse trading town at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, a route that took roughly 5 days of sailing under favourable conditions, according to his own account. The contrast matters. This wasn't a man who only knew how to survive extreme, unprecedented cold. He was, day to day, an ordinary long-distance trader working an established southern route between well-known ports, the Arctic exploration representing an unusual, deliberate departure from his normal business rather than his whole life's work. It's worth remembering that even the most remarkable individual voyages in tonight's script were the exception, not the rule. For the people making them, most nights aboard most Norse ships looked much more like Kettle's routine trading run from the very first chapter than like Other's push past the North Cape. There's a specific sensory detail worth sitting with about high-latitude Arctic nights that Other's own account doesn't mention directly, but which any sailor making a voyage at that latitude and season would almost certainly have witnessed: the aurora borealis, visible with striking frequency and intensity at the latitudes Other describes sailing through. Norse sources elsewhere in the broader medieval Scandinavian tradition reference the lights, sometimes attributing them to reflections off the shields of Valkyries or other mythological explanations, though the specific belief systems tied to the aurora are harder to pin down with confidence for this particular period and region than some popular retellings suggest. Whatever explanation a given crew reached for, the practical experience would have been the same: standing an exhausted watch on a freezing exposed deck and looking up to see the sky itself moving in slow, coloured ribbons of green and sometimes red. A moment of genuine, undeniable wonder folded directly into one of the hardest, coldest nights this entire script has described. It's a useful reminder that even the grimmest conditions this whole night has walked through weren't purely grim. Something in a night like that could still, apparently, stop a half-frozen sailor in his tracks and make him look up. Other's account gives a few additional practical specifics worth including here, because they tell us something about exactly what kind of operation this Arctic push actually was. He describes himself as undertaking the voyage largely on his own initiative, with his own ship and, implicitly, his own crew, rather than as part of some larger royal or chieftain-sponsored expedition. A detail that underscores just how much individual, entrepreneurial risk-taking sat behind voyages like this one. There's no indication in the surviving account of a large fleet or extensive royal backing, this reads, throughout, as one wealthy but essentially private trader deciding the walrus, the ivory and simple curiosity about the coastline were worth personally financing and personally risking a voyage into water nobody else had charted. That kind of individual initiative, more than any centralised state project, characterises an enormous amount of Viking Age exploration and expansion, small crews, personally financed, pushing outward one voyage at a time, rather than anything resembling a coordinated national exploration programme in the modern sense. It's also worth noting what Other doesn't mention, because the absence is nearly as informative as the presence of detail elsewhere in his account. He offers no description of any dramatic storm, shipwreck or near disaster during this specific Arctic voyage, despite everything modern readers know about the objective danger of the water and climate he was navigating. Either the voyage genuinely went about as smoothly as a voyage into uncharted Arctic water could reasonably go, or Other, reporting to a foreign king rather than confiding in family, simply chose not to dwell on the frightening parts. A very human, very understandable kind of selective storytelling that shows up constantly in historical eyewitness accounts across every era, including, quite possibly, in some of what gets left out of the accounts underlying every other chapter in tonight's script. There's also the matter of exactly how Othere and his crew would have handled the near-total absence of any friendly resupply point along this entire route. Unlike Ketil's coastal trading run or Star's settlement crossing, both of which followed at least broadly known paths toward an intended destination, Othere's Arctic push offered no equivalent safety net, no trading post, no known farmstead, nothing but whatever the ship itself carried, and whatever could be hunted or gathered along an unfamiliar shore. That self-sufficiency demanded a level of provisioning discipline beyond even what the rest of tonight's script has described. Every cask of water, every strip of dried fish, calculated not against a known number of days to a known harbour, but against genuine uncertainty about how long the voyage might actually take before turning back, became the only sensible option. It's a sobering thought to sit with, wrapped in your own wool right now. Othere's crew never knew, at the outset, exactly how many of these cold, exposed nights they were actually signing up for. Othere's account closes, in the surviving text almost as plainly as it began. No dramatic flourish, no claim of glory, just a description of turning the ship south and making the long return journey home along the same coastline he'd charted on the way out. This time, with the considerable advantage of knowing roughly what to expect. That return leg, retracing known water rather than pushing into the unknown, would have felt, by every measure this script has established tonight, like a genuine relief, familiar landmarks, a rough sense of how many days remained, and the specific psychological comfort of no longer sleeping each night, wondering what tomorrow's entirely unmapped coastline might reveal. Not every Norse voyager who pushed past the edge of the known map left behind a transcript this clear, or a return home this uneventful. A little over a century after Othere's journey, another Norse expedition would sail even farther west than anyone in his story ever attempted, into water so far from home that even the sagas written about it, generations later. Can't quite agree on all the details. There's a very specific sound that means relief on a Viking Age voyage, the low grinding scrape of a keel meeting gravel, the moment a ship finally noses up onto a beach and stops moving the way it's been moving, without pause, for the last several hours. You feel it travel up through the hull and into your own tired legs before you consciously register what it means, and for one brief, genuine moment, it feels like the day's hardest work is over. It is not. It's about to become a different kind of hard work, and this is where tonight's story shifts from the open water itself to something almost as demanding. The nightly ritual, wherever coastline allowed it, of making camp. Here's the subversion nobody warns you about. Beaching the ship doesn't mean rest. It means labour, immediately, before anyone so much as thinks about sleep. Cargo has to come off, or at minimum be resecured against tide and weather. The ship itself needs anchoring or hauling further up the beach, out of reach of a rising tide that could otherwise carry it off in the night, with nobody aboard to stop it, and somebody has to scout the immediate area, not for scenery, but for threat, because an unfamiliar coastline at dusk is exactly the kind of place an unfriendly local population, a rival trading party, or simply the wrong kind of terrain could turn a routine overnight stop into a genuine crisis. That scouting duty tonight falls to a crewman named Halvard, a Broad, quiet man in his 30s who has sailed this general stretch of coast 3 times before, and has developed, over those trips, a specific habit worth noticing. Before he ever draws his knife or raises an alarm, he stops completely still and listens for a full count of 10. A discipline he apparently picked up from an older relative who drowned out too many real warnings by reacting to every rustle in the dark. Halvard's stillness, more than his strength, is what the crew actually relies on him for, and you'll see exactly why before this night is through. By the time the ship is secured, building a fire becomes the crew's next priority, and it's a harder task than it sounds, especially on a rain-soaked coastline where dry kindling is a genuine scarcity rather than an assumption. Norse fire-starting technology relied on flint and steel striking sparks into a prepared tinder, often dried fungus. Specifically a hard bracket fungus known to have been used across much of northern Europe for exactly this purpose, sometimes carried pre-treated and dried specifically so a damp landfall wouldn't leave a crew without the means to make fire at all. Getting that fire lit and fed into something that will hold through the night isn't optional. It's the difference between a camp with hot food and dry, if only briefly, clothing, and one without either. Once the fire is genuinely established, the crew turns to food, and here the mundane comfort of a hot meal gets its own small subversion. Cooking ashore usually means a simple pot suspended over the flame, filled with whatever combination of dried fish, grain and foraged greens the crew can manage, seasoned with little beyond salt, if that. It's not a feast. It's calories delivered warm, which after a day of rowing or bailing and a night of exactly the discomfort you experienced 2 chapters ago, genuinely does feel like a small luxury. You eat quickly, aware that the fire's warmth is the closest thing to real comfort this entire voyage has offered you so far, and you're reluctant to give up your spot near it even as your stomach empties and exhaustion starts pulling harder than hunger. Here's the thing about camping on an unfamiliar shore that the ship itself never has to worry about. Exposure to threat from land as well as sea. Norse sources, along with the accounts of the communities Norse traders and raiders interacted with, make clear that beaching a ship on unfamiliar or contested coastline carried genuine risk of ambush, theft or worse, a risk sharp enough that even peaceful trading expeditions typically maintained the same disciplined watch rotation on land that they kept at sea. This is precisely why Halvard's job matters as much as it does. A crew that let its guard down simply because solid ground felt safer than open water was, historically, exactly the kind of crew that didn't make it home to tell anyone about the mistake. By full dark, with the fire banked to a manageable fuel-conserving glow, the crew turns to constructing whatever shelter tonight's stop allows. On a short overnight stop, this usually means little more than cloaks, the jarled cloth if it's been brought ashore, and bodies arranged close around the fire's remaining warmth. On a longer stay, a stopover of several days waiting out weather, or a planned staging point along a known route, it might mean something more substantial, a simple turf and branch lean-to, or in rare, well-documented cases along established trading routes, use of an existing shore camp maintained by previous expeditions, sometimes called a long fort further along Norse-influenced coastlines like Ireland's, where semi-permanent fortified ship camps served exactly this purpose across multiple seasons rather than being rebuilt from nothing each time. Tonight's stop is a short one though, which means you're sleeping close to the fire, close to your crewmates, and still, despite solid ground beneath you for the first time in days, not especially warm. Halvard takes the first watch, moving to the tree line at the edge of camp with the same deliberate stillness that defines him, and roughly 2 hours in. That stillness pays off in exactly the way it's meant to. He hears something, not the wind, not the surf, but a distinct, deliberate rustle of movement in the brush beyond the fire's light. And instead of shouting an immediate alarm that might scatter the crew into confusion or provoke a hasty, poorly aimed response, he holds his count of 10, listens again, and identifies the sound correctly as a foraging animal rather than a human threat before quietly returning to his post. It's a small, almost invisible act of competence. Nobody wakes up, nobody panics, nothing dramatic happens, and it's precisely the kind of unglamorous vigilance that kept camps like this one safe, night after night, without ever making it into a single saga. The bad news about camping ashore, though, is that solid ground solves exactly one problem, the constant motion of an open hull, and leaves nearly every other discomfort fully intact. Wind still finds you, often worse than it did afloat, since a beach offers none of a hull's low profile against a steady onshore breeze. Rain still soaks whatever wool you're relying on, and a fire, however well tended, only warms the side of your body actually facing it, leaving your back exposed to the same cold that's been the running theme of this entire night. You rotate periodically, the way everyone around this fire is rotating, turning your damp side toward the heat and your warm side toward the dark, in a slow, semi-conscious dance that continues for hours without anyone quite deciding to start it. Around midnight, the wind picks up hard enough to threaten the fire directly, forcing 2 crew members to physically build a low windbreak from driftwood and packed sand to keep the flames from scattering into embers across dry brush, a real danger on a wooded coastline, and one nobody wants to explain to a ship's captain, let alone a local landowner, if it gets out of hand. Halvard, midway through his watch rotation, helps brace the windbreak with his own body for several minutes rather than leaving the 2 struggling crewmates to manage it alone, a small, physically uncomfortable act of solidarity that costs him warmth he can't easily get back. It's the same unsentimental generosity Catil showed Skeggy 2 chapters ago. Dressed in different clothes, not a grand gesture, just a practical calculation that the fire staying lit matters more than his own momentary comfort, made by someone who understands exactly what losing that fire would cost everyone else trying to sleep around it. By the time Halvard's watch ends and he's relieved by another crewman, well past midnight, he settles into the spot nearest the fire's remaining heat, an unspoken courtesy the crew extends to whoever just finished the hardest watch of the night, one more small, undocumented kindness, holding this whole arrangement together. He's asleep within minutes, the same deep, sudden exhaustion sleep everyone aboard eventually learns to drop into regardless of noise or discomfort, because a body pushed hard enough for long enough stops being picky about conditions and simply takes what rest it can get whenever it's offered. Dawn arrives ashore differently than it did at sea, less a grey seam on the horizon, more a slow lightening through the tree line, birdsong picking up well before the crew stirs. You wake stiff, one side of your body warmer than the other from the fire's uneven heat, boots still damp from yesterday, and the crew begins the reverse of last night's labour, banking the fire fully out, loading cargo back aboard, checking the ship's hull for any damage the beaching might have caused. There's no lingering. Whatever rest this shore camp provided, partial and uneven as it was, is already being spent on the work of getting the ship back into the water, back into open water, back into exactly the conditions this whole night was a brief, hard-won reprieve from. It's worth understanding why a captain would choose to beach at all, given how much extra labour it demands compared to simply pressing on through the night the way Ketil's crew did back in the very first chapter. The decision usually came down to a calculation any experienced Norse sailor would have run instinctively. Known, mapped coastline with a safe, sheltered landing point available was almost always preferable to open water, purely because solid ground removed the risk of a hull striking submerged rocks in the dark, and because a beached ship could be inspected and repaired far more easily than a leaking one at sea. The trade-off, extra labour, extra exposure to land-based threat, a fire that only warms one side of you at a time, was one experienced crew's accepted readily whenever the coastline made it available, because the alternative risks it eliminated were, on balance, considerably worse. Pressing on through open water overnight was less a bold choice than a forced one, made only when geography left no safer option. Some of these shore stops, along well-travelled Norse trading and raiding routes, grew into something considerably more permanent than a single night's camp. Archaeological excavation at sites like Woodstown, along Ireland's River Suir, and the much larger, better documented Longfort that eventually grew into the city of Dublin itself, has revealed evidence of exactly this kind of camp evolving over repeated seasons into semi-fortified bases, defensive earthworks, evidence of ship repair, and material culture, suggesting crews return to the same protected stretch of shoreline again and again, rather than starting from nothing on unfamiliar ground each trip. Dublin's own Norse settlement is conventionally dated to around 841, when a Longfort was reportedly established there, and within roughly 2 centuries that same stretch of riverbank had grown into a genuine urban trading centre, one whose Norse-founded street pattern is still, remarkably, traceable in parts of the modern city today. Tonight's small, exhausted camp on an unnamed beach and a thriving medieval trading city share the exact same origin story, separated mainly by time, repetition, and the accumulated labour of thousands of nights just like this one. There's something worth sitting with in that continuity. Every discomfort you just experienced ashore, the uneven fire warmth, the damp boots. Halvard's careful 10 count in the dark was multiplied across enough seasons and enough crews making the same calculated choice to beach rather than press on. Quite literally, the raw material cities were eventually built from. Nobody standing around that windbreak at midnight was thinking about founding Dublin. They were thinking about staying warm enough to survive until dawn, and yet here you are, 11 centuries later, able to walk streets that trace their shape back to exactly this kind of ordinary, unglamorous night. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people expecting Viking Age hygiene to be non-existent. It wasn't. And the archaeology backs that up more clearly than almost any other aspect of daily Norse life. Fine-toothed combs, typically carved from antler or bone, are among the most commonly recovered personal items at Norse settlement and campsites across the entire Viking world, found in numbers that suggest regular routine use rather than rare luxury. Weeks of unwashed travel, close quarters and shared bedding made lice an unavoidable practical problem rather than a moral failing, and a crew that valued its own comfort and frankly its own morale treated regular combing as basic maintenance. The Viking Age equivalent of brushing your teeth before bed. Around tonight's fire, more than one crew member takes a few minutes before settling in to work a comb through hair and beard alike, a small, almost domestic ritual that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with making an uncomfortable night marginally less miserable. Once the practical work of the evening is done, fire built, food eaten, watch assigned, camps like this one often turned, for a little while at least, to something closer to entertainment, and this is where the culture's deep, well-documented love of storytelling and verse earns its place in tonight's account. A skilled reciter of poetry, sometimes a dedicated scold attached to a chieftain's household, but just as often simply the crew member with the best memory for verse. Might offer a few stanzas by the fire before everyone finally gave in to exhaustion, genealogies, half-remembered myths, or accounts of earlier voyages, composed in the tightly structured alliterative verse forms Norse poetry favoured, forms demanding enough that skilled composition and recitation were genuinely respected skills, not idle pastime. It's easy to imagine this scene sliding into cliché, the bard by the fire, but the practical function it served was real and specific, a shared communal activity that gave an exhausted, cold, frightened crew somewhere to put their attention besides the dark tree line Halvard is watching, or the ache of another uncomfortable night ahead. Story, in a very literal sense, was part of how this crew got through the evening before sleep finally took them, the same way the fire and the wool were. Not every shore stop was purely self-sufficient, either, and this particular crew's supply situation improves noticeably around midnight, when a small, cautious trade takes place at the edge of camp. A local farmer, drawn by the fire's glow, and evidently familiar enough with passing Norse crews to recognise an opportunity rather than an immediate threat, approaches with dried meat and a portion of stored grain, trading it for a length of the crew's own Vamel wool cloth, the same standardised currency-grade cloth this whole world runs on, discussed at greater length later tonight. The exchange is brief, wary on both sides, and conducted mostly through gesture rather than shared language, but it's a useful reminder that unfamiliar coastline didn't always mean hostile coastline. Norse trading networks depended enormously on exactly this kind of small, cautious, mutually beneficial exchange with local populations along every route they travelled, and a crew's survival through a hard night often depended as much on a stranger's willingness to trade fairly as it did on their own gear and discipline. By the time this small transaction wraps up and the farmer disappears back into the dark tree line, the crew's food situation for the remaining leg of the voyage looks noticeably less precarious than it did an hour earlier. A small, unremarkable moment of ordinary commerce that nonetheless meaningfully improves everyone's odds of a comfortable, well-fed remainder of the trip. It's not the kind of encounter that makes it into sagas or legend. It's just Tuesday night trade, the unglamorous connective tissue holding an entire continent's worth of Norse coastal travel together, one cautious exchange of wool for grain at a time. There's a final small ritual worth mentioning before this camp finally settles fully into sleep. Someone, usually whoever's closest to the fire and not yet on watch, banks the coals carefully into a low, slow burning mound designed to hold a living ember through until morning rather than burning bright and fast through the night's remaining hours. Getting this wrong meant waking to a cold, dead fire and the genuine labour of striking new sparks from flint and fungus tinder in the pre-dawn cold. A task nobody wanted after an already exhausting day. Getting it right meant a bed of live coals ready to be coaxed back into flame within minutes come morning. One small piece of foresight standing between the crew and an unnecessarily miserable start to the next day. It's the kind of quiet, practiced competence that never gets written down anywhere, precisely because it worked well enough, often enough that nobody thought to remark on it. There's one more small but telling piece of gear worth mentioning before this camp finally settles. The ship's anchor stone, or in many documented cases simply a large, deliberately shaped rock with a hole bored through for rope, set out from the beached hull as extra insurance against a rising tide working the ship loose overnight, despite the hauling and securing already done. It's a low-tech, almost embarrassingly simple solution to a real risk. A crew waking to find their only way home quietly floated off during the night. But it worked, reliably, for exactly the reason so much of tonight's technology has worked, not through sophistication, but through generations of accumulated, practical trial and error, refining a solution until it reliably did its one job. Halvard checks the anchor stone's set personally, before finally allowing himself to consider the night's work done. One more small, unglamorous act of diligence standing between this crew and a considerably worse morning. Even the simple act of drying boots by the fire carried its own small ritual weight after days of damp feet. A discomfort so constant aboard ship that a single evening spent with genuinely warm, dry feet felt disproportionately luxurious. A reminder of how quickly this whole crew's baseline for comfort had recalibrated itself against the ordinary misery of the crossing. One last practical matter settles the night before sleep fully claims the camp. Someone always counts the crew, aloud or simply by a careful scan of shapes around the fire, confirming that everyone who walked ashore is still accounted for. It's a small, almost superstitious habit, dressed up as practical bookkeeping, but it matters enormously on an unfamiliar coastline where a single missing crewman wandered too far from camp or simply asleep somewhere unexpected, could otherwise go unnoticed until a departure the next morning left him stranded for good. Every name is accounted for tonight, which is its own small, quiet victory worth acknowledging before the fire finally burns down to embers. Not every Norse expedition had the luxury of a known coastline, a returning route, or even solid confirmation that land existed at all where they were headed. The furthest and strangest of these voyages pushed west past every mapped shore the Norse world knew, chasing rumours of timber-rich land that almost nobody back home fully believed was real, and the man credited with finally reaching it left behind a story so tangled with legend that historians are still working out, more than 1,000 years later, exactly where fact ends and saga embellishment begins. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, one of two medieval Icelandic sagas that record this story, and the two don't fully agree with each other, a discrepancy worth flagging plainly rather than smoothing over. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown badly off course sometime around 985 or 986, sighting an unfamiliar forested coastline far to the west of Greenland without ever going ashore to investigate it. He simply turned back, land unclaimed and unexplored, and the story might have ended there entirely if a young man named Leif, son of the notorious exile Eric the Red, hadn't later bought Bjarni's ship and decided the smart move was to go find out what Bjarni had seen. This is the story of Leif Erikson, and of a coastline that more than 1,000 years later, archaeologists have finally confirmed his crew genuinely reached. Even if exactly which crew member deserves the credit remains, honestly, still somewhat disputed between the two saga traditions telling it. Leif's own background sets the stage for why anyone in his family was pushing this far into unmapped water in the first place. His father, Eric Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Eric the Red, had been exiled from Iceland around 982 for killing several men in a feud, a punishment under Norse law that, rather than execution, typically meant a period of enforced outlawry during which the exile had to leave the settled community entirely or risk being killed without legal consequence by anyone who found him. Eric used that exile productively, sailing west and eventually founding the first permanent Norse settlement on Greenland around 985. A colony whose archaeological remains, most notably the farmstead at Brattle, confirm the sagas got at least this much substantially right. Leif, then, grew up in a family whose entire recent history was built on sailing toward land nobody else had confirmed was safe, livable, or even real, which makes his decision to chase Bjarni's sighting look less like a wild gamble and more like simply the family business. The two surviving saga accounts disagree on the details of what happened next, in ways that matter for how carefully this story needs to be told. The saga of the Greenlanders credits Leif with deliberately retracing Bjarni's route and making 3 successive landings, naming each stretch of coast as he found it. Helluland, meaning roughly flat stone land, generally identified by modern historians with Baffin Island, Markland, Forest Land, likely corresponding to the coast of Labrador, and finally Vinland, whose exact meaning is itself debated, either wineland, for wild grapes the crew reportedly found there, or possibly meadowland, depending on how a particular Old Norse vowel is read in the earliest manuscripts. The other account, the saga of Eric the Red, tells a somewhat different version, where Leif's discovery of Vinland happens more by accident, blown off course on a return voyage from Norway rather than through Bjarni's earlier sighting. Historians generally treat both as saga tradition rather than settled documentary fact, written down roughly 2 centuries after the events they describe, shaped by oral transmission and storytelling convention along the way, which means the broad strokes are probably grounded in something real, but the specific sequence of events, and quite possibly some of the specific dialogue and incident, reflects saga writers doing what saga writers always did with a good story. Whichever version is closer to the truth, the practical reality of sleeping through a voyage like this one would have been, if anything, more exposed and more disorienting than anything covered so far tonight. This wasn't a known crossing with an established destination waiting at the far end, the way the Iceland run was for Starr's family. This was open-ended exploration along a completely unfamiliar coastline, with no confirmed safe harbour, no known local population's disposition toward strangers, and no certainty, most nights, that tomorrow's anchorage would even exist. Every single night of this voyage carried the full compounded weight of everything you've already learned, the open hull, the shared wool, the rotating watch, with the added psychological burden of genuine uncertainty about what, or who, might be waiting just beyond the firelight. The saga tradition names one crew member specifically worth introducing here, because unlike Ketil, Starr or Halvard earlier tonight, he's not an invented illustration. He's a figure the medieval source itself names and gives a small, distinct personality to. Tyrkir, described in the saga of the Greenlanders as a member of Leif's household of southern, possibly German origin, is credited with discovering the wild grapes that reportedly gave Vinland its name, wandering off from the main landing party and returning in a state the saga describes, with a bit of saga-era comic exaggeration, as excited enough that he initially spoke in a language his companions couldn't follow before switching back to Norse to explain what he'd found. It's a small, human, oddly funny beat embedded in an otherwise sparse account, one of the few moments in the whole Vinland saga tradition where an individual crew member gets anything resembling a personality, rather than simply being a name in a list of who sailed where. Treat the specific comic detail as saga colour rather than verified biography, the way the accuracy rules for tonight's story require, but the broader shape of a mixed, non-uniformly Norse crew exploring unfamiliar coastline together is entirely consistent with what historians know about how Norse expeditions of this scale were typically staffed. By the time Leif's crew has established some kind of overwintering base, The sagas suggest the party stayed through at least one full winter before returning to Greenland, gathering timber and grapes to bring back, both valuable resources genuinely scarce in treeless Greenland and Iceland. The sleeping arrangements would have shifted from purely ship-based to something more permanent, likely turf-walled longhouses similar in construction to what the crew already knew from home, built using timber this coastline offered in an abundance neither Greenland nor Iceland could match. This matters more than it might initially seem. Part of what made Vinland so valuable to the Greenland colony wasn't glamour or conquest, it was straightforwardly practical. Ship repair, house construction, and simple firewood all required timber that Greenland's Norse settlers had to import at real cost and effort, and a coastline offering forests thick enough to build from represented a genuine, unglamorous economic prize, worth the risk of a voyage into completely unmapped water. For decades, all of this remained firmly in the category of saga tradition, plausible, evocative, but unconfirmed by anything outside the medieval Icelandic manuscripts themselves. That changed in 1960, when Norwegian explorer and writer Helge Ingstad, working with his wife, archaeologist Anne Steeningstad, located the remains of a Norse settlement at Landsorks Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, following local testimony about unusual mounded earthworks in the area. Excavations conducted through the 1960s uncovered the remains of several turf-walled buildings in a distinctly Norse architectural style, along with a small number of unmistakably Norse artefacts, a bronze cloak pin, iron boat rivets, and a stone spindle hall among them, providing the first solid archaeological confirmation that Norse voyagers had genuinely reached North America roughly 5 centuries before Columbus. It remains the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside Greenland, and whether it represents Leif's own specific landing site or a related nearby Norse camp from the same general period of exploration is a question the archaeology alone can't fully settle. The dating got dramatically more precise in 2021. When a team of researchers published findings in the journal Nature establishing that timber recovered from the site had been cut in the year 1021, a date pinned down with remarkable exactness using a cosmic ray event that left a detectable radiocarbon spike in tree rings worldwide that year, combined with the fact that the outermost bark-adjacent ring on the recovered wood could be precisely counted from that marker. That means archaeologists can now say, with a level of confidence rare in medieval history, that Norse people were cutting timber in Newfoundland in the specific year 1021, a full 471 years before Columbus's first Caribbean landfall, and a genuinely stunning confirmation that at least some version of the saga tradition surrounding Leif Erikson's family was grounded in real, datable, physical fact. The Vinland settlement, whatever its precise relationship to Leif's own voyage, didn't last. Saga accounts describe escalating conflict with the indigenous people the Norse called Skurlingar, a term whose exact scope and meaning is debated, and which the sagas apply somewhat loosely to indigenous peoples the Norse encountered across multiple different regions and encounters. What the sagas describe, in broad strokes, is initial contact followed by trade, then rising tension and violent conflict severe enough that the small, isolated Norse settlement judged the risk no longer worth the reward, particularly once the timber and resources gathered could simply be shipped back to Greenland instead of requiring a permanent foothold to keep harvesting. The archaeological evidence at Landsorks Meadows is consistent with a short-term, seasonal or multi-year camp rather than a long-term colony, workshops for boat repair and ironworking, but no evidence of extended generational settlement the way Greenland or Iceland had. Within a matter of years, by most reconstructions, the Norse had abandoned the site entirely, leaving the wider North American continent unclaimed by Europeans for another 5 centuries. There's something worth sitting with, quietly, in the gap between the saga's confident naming of Helluland, Markland and Vinland, and the archaeology's far more cautious, single confirmed site on a wind-scoured Newfoundland peninsula. The Norse who camped there, whoever exactly led them, slept through winters at a latitude and in a climate not drastically different from the fjord country most of them had left behind. Cold, damp, and reliant on exactly the wool, timber and turf building technology this whole script has been describing. What made their nights remarkable wasn't that the cold was worse than anything back home. It's that they endured it on a continent nobody in their entire cultural memory had ever set foot on before, farther from any possible rescue or resupply than any voyage in tonight's script so far, sleeping under an unfamiliar sky with no certainty whatsoever about what the coming season or the coming winter actually held. And then, having survived it, having built houses and repaired ships, and gathered grapes and timber across at least one full winter in a place literally no other European had ever slept, they left and largely stopped trying to return. Not because they couldn't survive there. The archaeology and the sagas together suggest they managed that part reasonably well. They left because the underlying cost-benefit calculation that drove nearly every decision in this entire script is the specific hardship worth the specific reward finally tipped the other way, once conflict with the land's existing inhabitants made the timber and grapes too expensive to keep collecting. It's a strangely modern, almost anticlimactic ending for a story this dramatic, not defeat, not disaster, just a quiet, practical decision that the math no longer worked, made by people who had already proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they were entirely capable of enduring whatever the voyage demanded. To understand why Leif's family kept pushing further west in the first place, it helps to understand exactly how marginal life in Greenland itself actually was. Eric the Red's settlement, established around 985, eventually grew into two main colonies Norse sources called the Eastern and Western settlements, supporting at their peak an estimated population somewhere in the low thousands, farming a landscape that offered only a narrow, difficult growing season and required importing timber, iron and grain from Iceland and Norway at real cost and real risk. Every advantage a new coastline could offer, better timber, better grazing, a longer growing season, represented a genuine practical improvement to a colony perpetually working at the edge of what its environment could support. Greenland's Norse settlements didn't last. In the end, the most widely accepted view among historians points to a combination of a cooling climate during what's now called the Little Ice Age, disrupted trade routes, and the sheer accumulated strain of subsisting at the margins of viability, with the last confirmed written record from the Norse Greenland settlements dating to the early 15th century and the settlements themselves believed to have been fully abandoned by some point not long after. Leif's western voyage happened at the very beginning of that colony's life, when hope for exactly this kind of expansion still ran high, long before anyone could have guessed how the story would eventually end. The saga of the Greenlanders doesn't let Leif's family's western ambitions end with him. Either his sister, Freyd's Irkstatir, is credited in the same saga tradition with leading her own expedition to Vinland some years later, alongside two Icelandic brothers, in a venture the saga describes as ending in serious, violent conflict within the Norse party itself, rather than with any outside. Threat, a dark, complicated episode the saga doesn't shy away from, and one that historians treat with the same appropriate caution applied to every other detail from this source, plausible in its broad shape, but recorded generations after the fact, and shaped by storytelling convention along the way. What the account does make clear, regardless of the specific disputed details, is that Norse exploration of this coastline wasn't a single man's singular achievement. It was a family enterprise, spanning at least 2 generations and more than one sibling, each voyage building on the last crew's account of what the coastline actually offered, and what dangers it actually posed. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it's a genuine, if partial, relief after everything this script has described so far, by most reconstructions of Vinland's likely location and the saga's own description of self-sown wheat and wild grapes growing there. The climate this expedition eventually reached was almost certainly milder than the fjord country of Norway, and dramatically milder than Greenland. Grapes, whatever the exact botanical species the sagas mean by the term, don't grow at Greenland's latitude or in Greenland's climate. Their presence in the saga account is itself indirect evidence that this crew had genuinely sailed into a meaningfully warmer environment than anything they'd known at home. that doesn't mean the nights were warm, or the crossing to get there was anything but exactly as brutal as everything else in tonight's script. But it does mean that for once, the destination itself offered some genuine relief from the cold that every other chapter tonight has centred on. A small, ironic mercy for a crew that had endured one of the coldest, most exposed ocean crossings anyone in the entire Norse world had ever attempted, arriving finally somewhere gentler than the home they'd left behind. It's worth being honest too about just how unresolved the question of Vinland's exact location and extent remains among historians and archaeologists, beyond the single confirmed site at Lonsor Meadows. That site sits at the northern tip of Newfoundland, but the sagas describe Leif's party continuing further south and exploring additional coastline beyond their first landing, into territory some researchers have argued could extend as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or even further along the eastern seaboard, based on the saga's own geographic descriptions of climate, vegetation, and native wildlife encountered. No confirmed second Norse site has been identified anywhere along that broader stretch of coastline, despite considerable searching, which means Lonsor Meadows may represent a base camp for exploration that ranged considerably further, or it may represent close to the full extent of what these voyages actually achieved. The more expansive saga geography reflecting some combination of genuine exploration and later narrative elaboration. Historians generally treat this as a genuinely open question rather than a settled one, and it's worth resisting the temptation, however tempting the story, to claim more geographic certainty than the current archaeological record actually supports. What isn't in serious dispute, regardless of exactly how far south this expedition's exploration ultimately ranged, is the fundamental fact of the crossing itself, and the fundamental fact of the nights this chapter has been describing throughout. Nights spent further from any possible rescue, resupply or return than any other voyage in tonight's entire script, undertaken by people who had no way of knowing, setting out, whether the land Bjarni glimpsed years earlier even still existed, let alone whether it could sustain them through a winter. That uncertainty is, in its own way, the real subject of this chapter, more than any specific coastline or archaeological dating technique. Leif's crew, whoever exactly led them, and wherever exactly they ultimately explored, slept every one of those uncertain nights anyway, wrapped in the same wool, sheltering under the same kind of turf and timber construction, trusting the same accumulated generations of Norse seafaring knowledge that carried every other crew into tonight's script, through their own respective ordeals. It's worth remembering, too, exactly what these nights would have felt like for a crew constantly alert to the possibility of encountering this new land's existing inhabitants, entirely unknown to them at the outset of the voyage. Every rustle beyond the firelight carried a different weight than it did back on a familiar Norwegian coastline or even the sparsely populated shore of Iceland. Not necessarily more dangerous, but genuinely unknown in a way nothing else in tonight's script has quite matched, since even Other's Arctic push followed a coastline at least broadly connected to peoples and trade networks his culture had some indirect knowledge of. Leif's crew slept, every single night of this expedition, with less certainty about what surrounded their camp than any other group you've met tonight, and did so anyway, because the potential reward of timber, grapes, and a genuinely new stretch of habitable land was judged worth that specific, compounded uncertainty. There's a particular kind of exhaustion specific to this crossing, distinct from the physical exhaustion covered so thoroughly elsewhere tonight, the exhaustion of genuine sustained uncertainty night after night, with no prior voyage's account to reassure a tired mind that tomorrow would likely look like today. Every other crew you've met tonight, however hard their conditions, could draw on some inherited body of knowledge about roughly what to expect. Ketil's crew knew this stretch of the North Sea. Star's family knew Iceland existed and had been safely reached before. Even Othere was navigating along a coastline that eventually connected to trade routes his culture partially understood. Leif's crew had none of that comfort. They slept each night the way you might if you genuinely didn't know whether tomorrow held safe harbour or disaster, and did it anyway, for an entire winter, in a place no living person from their world had ever called home. It's a strange, humbling thing to consider, an entire family's ambition, spanning Eric's exile, Leif's purchase of Bjarni's ship, and Freyd's own later voyage, together amounted to barely more than a handful of documented winters spent on a continent that would go unclaimed by Europeans again for 500 years afterward. Big ambitions, this whole family's story suggests, don't always produce big lasting outcomes. Sometimes they simply produce a few remarkable, well-earned winters, remembered imperfectly, and a scatter of iron rivets waiting patiently under Newfoundland turf for someone to finally come looking. Every voyage in tonight's script so far has eventually reached somewhere. Iceland, the White Sea, a Newfoundland peninsula nobody back home believed was real. But not every Norse voyage was aimed at open water or unclaimed coastline at all. Some of the longest, coldest nights this culture ever endured happened not while crossing an ocean, but while waiting, deliberately and for months at a stretch, in the one season the entire Viking world agreed was too dangerous to sail through at all. Wood smoke again, but different this time, heavier, more permanent smelling, mixed with the particular mustiness of turf walls and packed earth rather than open sea air. You're not sleeping aboard a ship tonight, or even in a quick overnight beach camp. You're several months into an overwintering layover, part of a Norse expedition, trading, raiding, or some blend of both, as was often the case. That made the calculated decision, sometime in early autumn, that the sailing season had closed, and the safest option left was to dig in somewhere and wait for spring. This was not a rare or desperate choice. Norse fleets and trading parties overwintering far from home is a documented, recurring pattern across the Viking Age, particularly in England, Ireland, and Francia, where raiding forces regularly established fortified winter camps rather than attempting a dangerous late-season crossing back home. Here's the mundane comfort this setup offers, and here's how fast it curdles solid walls at last. Something resembling real shelter after months of exactly the exposure you've been living through all evening. The camp itself, built from earthworks, repurposed local structures, and turf and timber construction familiar from home, genuinely does block wind and rain in a way no Tiald ever fully could. But winter in an unfamiliar country, hundreds of miles from your own farmland and stores, brings a different kind of danger entirely. Supply. There's no harvest here that belongs to you, no stockpiled grain from a summer you spent working this specific soil. Everything the camp eats through the winter has to be raided, traded, or rationed from what was carried in or seized early, and by midwinter, that math gets uncomfortably tight for everyone involved. Meet Ref, a crewman well past 40, old, by the standards of Viking Age life expectancy, for anyone still actively rowing and raiding, who has overwintered away from home more times than anyone else in this particular camp, and whose specific habit has become something the younger men quietly rely on without fully admitting it, every evening, regardless of how exhausted or cold he is. Ref walks the perimeter of the camp once before settling in to sleep, not because anyone assigned him to, but because he says a camp that's been checked by an old man's tired feet sleeps easier than one that hasn't. Nobody teases him for it anymore. Too many of them have started doing the same thing themselves, by the first hard frost, arriving noticeably earlier here than it would back home. Depending on exactly where this particular camp has settled for the season, the mood shifts from cautious optimism to grim practicality. Foraging parties range further from camp, looking for anything edible the local landscape or local population might yield through trade, since raiding indiscriminately this deep into a winter layover risks provoking exactly the kind of coordinated local resistance that turned deadly for other Norse camps in similar situations. You spend these weeks doing whatever the camp needs, mending gear that won't need repair again until spring, standing watch against both weather and hostile locals, and sleeping, finally, in something resembling a real bed, a raised timber platform layered with bracken, straw, and wool that still, despite every improvement over a ship's deck, never quite manages to be warm. 6 weeks into the layover, the thing every Norse winter camp historically feared more than any local army finally starts moving through the crowded, undernourished quarters: illness. Cramped shelter, imperfect sanitation, shared bedding, and bodies already run down by months of poor nutrition and cold exposure created exactly the conditions infectious disease thrives in. And the archaeological record backs this up more grimly than any saga does. Excavations at Repton in Derbyshire, England, site of a well-documented Viking winter camp associated with the Great Heathen Army around 873 and 874, uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of over 200 individuals, analysis of which, published across several studies since the original 1980s excavation and refined through radiocarbon dating in the following decades, is consistent with a mix of battle injury and disease-related death among an overwintering force. 200 people in one grave from a single camp's hard season. That's not a saga exaggerating for effect. That's a shovel finding exactly what winter camps like this one actually cost. You watch ref start declining sometime in the 7th week, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific, worrying way an experienced person's decline tends to show itself before anyone else fully clocks it. He walks his nightly perimeter a little slower. He's coughing, deep and wet, in a way that doesn't clear by morning the way an ordinary cold would, and 2 of his toes on his left foot have gone a colour that everyone in this camp, including Ref himself, recognises without needing it explained: frostbite, advanced enough that infection, not just discomfort, is now the real threat. Norse medical practice had no antibiotics and no formal germ theory, but it did have practical, empirically developed knowledge of wound care, cleaning, drainage, and in severe cases, amputation of dead or dying tissue to prevent it from poisoning the rest of the body. A procedure grim, painful, and, by the standards available, sometimes genuinely life-saving. This is where the ship's articles and the camp's own social contract, which you've heard referenced all evening as the glue holding these crews together, stop being an abstraction and become something you watch happen in front of you. Ref doesn't have kin in this camp. His own sons stayed home this year to manage the farm. But the crew treats his situation with exactly the seriousness Norse custom and law demanded. A portion of the group's shared supplies redirected specifically to keep him fed and warm, someone assigned to sit with him through the worst nights, and a clear, if unspoken, understanding that if Ref doesn't survive this, his share of whatever the expedition ultimately brings home goes to his family. Regardless, the same compensation principle underlying the Wurjald system that governed death and injury across Norse law more broadly. Care here isn't sentiment layered on top of practicality. It's the practicality, a system built specifically so that a man like Ref, giving his labour and his risk to an expedition that isn't his own land or his own harvest, knows his family won't be abandoned to bear the cost alone if the winter takes him. The amputation, when it finally becomes unavoidable, happens on an ordinary evening, by firelight, with 3 men holding Ref steady and a 4th, the closest thing this camp has to a healer. A role usually filled by whoever's picked up the most practical wound care experience over years of exactly this kind of expedition, rather than any formal surgeon. Working as quickly and cleanly as the crude iron tools available allow. There's no anaesthesia beyond whatever strong drink the camper's left, no guarantee this saves him, rather than simply hastening the infection spread. Ref bites down on a strip of leather and makes almost no other sound, a specific, documented kind of stoicism Norse sources associate with the concept of drengskappa discussed earlier tonight. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain become the thing that defines how you're remembered by the people watching. You hold his shoulder through it, because someone asked you to, and because by this point in a long winter layover, you're no longer entirely a stranger to any of these men, even the ones you didn't know a season ago. He survives it. Not without cost, Ref will walk with a permanent limp for whatever remains of his life, missing most of his left foot's forward toes, and the frostbite has left lasting nerve damage that will make cold weather, specifically, cruelly, worse for him for the rest of his years. But he survives, and by late winter he's back to his nightly perimeter walk, slower now, leaning on a length of ash woodcut and shaped specifically to help him manage it, still insisting a checked camp sleeps easier than an unchecked one. Nobody argues with him about it anymore. If anything, the younger men in camp have started walking it with him, partly for his safety, and partly, though none of them would say so directly, because it's become something worth protecting now, not just a habit, but a small, specific piece of what this particular winter cost, and what it didn't manage to take. Not every camp's winter ends this way. The Repton numbers make that plain enough without needing further elaboration, and Ref himself knows it, which is part of why he never complains about the limp where the younger men can hear him. There's a version of this winter, closer than anyone likes to think about, where he's one of the 200 instead of one of the survivors telling the story afterward. That knowledge doesn't make him bitter. If anything, it seems to make him gentler, in the specific, undemonstrative way an older man who's outlived several winters he probably shouldn't have tends to get gentler, watching younger crewmates make the same mistakes and small kindnesses he made decades earlier. By the time the ice finally starts breaking up along the coastline and the first reliably favourable winds return, sometime in what your body, more than any calendar, has come to recognise as early spring, the whole camp's mood shifts in a way that's almost physical to stand inside. Gear gets checked and rechecked. The ship, hauled up and sheltered through the worst of the winter months, is inspected plank by plank for any damage the cold and damp might have caused. And Ref, standing at the edge of camp on his last night before the fleet departs, walks his perimeter one final time, not because the camp needs it anymore, with everyone alert and eager to finally be moving, but because it's become, over one very long winter, simply who he is now, missing toes and all. Here's the thing worth carrying out of this particular chapter. More than any single grim statistic or gruesome procedure, overwintering wasn't the exception to Viking Age sailing, the way it might be tempting to frame it. It was a routine, recurring, well-understood part of how expeditions of any real length actually worked, built around a sober collective acceptance that some winters would cost lives, some would cost toes, and all of them would demand exactly the kind of shared, unglamorous endurance you just watched refs camp practice for months on end. The reward waiting on the other side of that winter: continued trade, continued raiding profit, continued survival to see another sailing season, was worth the specific, well-understood price for enough Norse expeditions across enough decades that the whole practice became simply another expected chapter in how a long voyage unfolded, no more remarkable to the people living it than the chapter that came before. The Repton excavation offers one more piece of evidence worth knowing, beyond the mass graves' raw numbers, because it puts a specific physical face on exactly the kind of injury and hardship this chapter has been describing. Archaeologists also recovered, from a separate burial near the mass grave, the remains of a man in his mid-30s, buried with distinct high-status grave goods: a sword, a Thor's hammer pendant, and most strikingly, a boar's tusk placed deliberately near his pelvis, in a position consistent with a severe injury to that part of his body, possibly sustained in battle around the time of the camp's occupation. Whatever the precise story behind that specific burial, it's a vivid physical reminder that the abstract categories this chapter has used all evening, disease, injury, exposure, represented, to the actual people living through a winter camp like this one. Specific, individual, remembered wounds, treated as best the community's medical knowledge allowed, and, in at least this one case, marked with genuine care and status in death regardless of how the injury itself was sustained. Ref isn't the only member of this particular camp whose winter takes a hard turn, and it would be dishonest to let his survival stand in for everyone's. A younger crewman, barely 20, develops a fever in the 9th week that the camp's makeshift healer recognises early as something more serious than an ordinary chill, likely based on the symptoms the healer describes to the rest of the crew. Some form of the same infectious illness the Repton evidence suggests killed so many in camps like this one. He doesn't recover. The crew buries him according to the rites they know, a small ceremony by the fire's edge rather than the elaborate ship burials reserved for figures of real status. His few possessions distributed among the crewmates who'll carry word of his death back to his family along with whatever compensation the expedition's shared resources can provide. Nobody in camp pretends this is anything other than what it is, a genuine loss, mourned quietly and specifically, not folded into an abstract statistic the way it's easy to do from 1,000 years' distance. You sit with the rest of the crew that evening, the fire a little smaller than usual, and understand, in a way the earlier chapters of tonight's script only gestured toward, that not every hardship in this story ends in survival and a good story to tell afterward. Late winter, just before the ice finally breaks, tends to be the hardest stretch of the entire layover, and this camp is no exception. Supplies that seemed carefully rationed back in early winter are, by this point, stretched to their genuine limit, with foraging parties returning more often than not, with less than they'd hoped for, and the crew's collective mood turning tight and short-tempered in the specific way prolonged hunger and cold reliably produce in any group of people, regardless of era. This is when Ref's steady, unglamorous presence matters most, not because he has any special solution to the food shortage, but because his calm, his nightly perimeter walk, his flat refusal to let the mood curdle into panic, gives the rest of the crew something to model their own behaviour on during exactly the weeks when panic would be most tempting and most dangerous. Leadership in a camp like this one wasn't always about rank. Sometimes it was simply about being the person who kept walking the same tired circuit every night, proving by example that the camp was still worth defending calmly rather than desperately. Even far from home, stranded together for months in cramped, stressful conditions, this camp doesn't abandon the basic structures of Norse law and dispute resolution. If anything, those structures matter more here than they would in an ordinary season, precisely because the close quarters and mounting stress of a hard winter make conflict between crew members more likely, not less. A dispute over rationing, a fight over a woman some crew members knew from a previous trading stop, an accusation of theft from the shared supply stores, any of these, left to fester, could fracture a camp's cohesion at exactly the moment it can least afford fracturing. Norse legal tradition, formalised in later written law codes but reflecting much older customary practice, provided for exactly this kind of dispute through assembly and arbitration rather than simple force. A version of the thing, the communal legislative and judicial assembly familiar from Norse communities back home, convened informally by whatever authority figures the expedition recognised, hearing grievances and rendering judgment according to shared, understood custom. It's a strikingly orderly response to embed inside a story this cold and this hard, but it's also exactly the kind of detail that explains how camps like this one avoided descending into the kind of chaos that would have made survival even less likely than it already was. Structure, even improvised and far from home, turns out to matter almost as much as fire and wool. This matters specifically for understanding a moment that comes late in the winter, when two younger crew members nearly come to blows over a genuine grievance, one accusing the other of taking more than his fair share from the dwindling grain stores during a night watch. Rather than letting the dispute settle itself through fists, the camp's senior men, Ref among them, insist on hearing both accounts properly in front of the assembled crew before rendering a judgment, a partial restitution owed, paid from the accused man's own future share of the expedition's eventual proceeds, and a formal acknowledgement from both parties that the matter is settled and not to be revisited with resentment. It's a small moment, resolved in an evening, but it's also a direct, practical demonstration of exactly the kind of documented Norse social structure, articles of shared conduct, formal grievance resolution, compensation in place of violence, that held a crew together through circumstances that could easily have torn it apart instead. One more detail about the physical space of the camp itself rounds out this picture. Sleeping quarters within an overwintering camp were typically arranged with the most vulnerable, including anyone recovering from injury or illness, as Ref eventually was, placed closest to the fire and furthest from the entrance. A simple, practical hierarchy of warmth that had nothing to do with formal status and everything to do with plain survival math. The men on watch, expected to be moving and therefore generating some of their own warmth regardless, took the colder positions nearer the entrance almost as a matter of course, without needing to be told. It's one more small undocumented piece of evidence for exactly the kind of practical, unsentimental care this whole camp organised itself around. Not everyone equally comfortable, but comfort distributed according to who needed it most, night after night, for as long as the winter lasted. Worth noting too, how differently this whole camp would have experienced the passage of the actual winter solstice, the shortest, darkest day of the year, depending on how far north this particular overwintering expedition had settled. Norse tradition marked this period with midwinter observances, the roots of what later Scandinavian custom would develop into Gel, the midwinter festival whose name and some of whose customs eventually blended into the modern Christmas most listeners will recognise, a deliberate communal acknowledgement that the darkest, coldest stretch of the year had arrived, and that surviving it together was worth marking, even amid genuine hardship and ration supplies. Ref, on the year's shortest night, breaks from his usual quiet reserve just long enough to share a cup of whatever weak, watered ale the campers left with the crewmates nearest him. A small, deliberate gesture of communal warmth offered specifically because the calendar itself called for it. It doesn't fix the food shortage or the cold. It simply reminds everyone in camp, for one evening, that the darkness was calculated to be temporary, and that something on the other side of it was worth waiting for. By the time this particular winter finally breaks, the camp has weathered exactly the combination of hardship and quiet, structural resilience this whole chapter has tried to make vivid, a death genuinely mourned. An amputation genuinely survived, a dispute genuinely resolved without violence, and a community of strangers and near strangers that somehow held together through all of it, not through sentiment, but through the same practical scaffolding of shared risk, fair compensation, and communal obligation that ran through every other chapter of tonight's story. The wool, the hides, and the crude but effective medical care that got Ref through that winter weren't incidental details. They were, in a very real sense, the actual technology keeping the entire Viking Age functioning. Quieter and less glamorous than any longship's prow, but arguably more essential to how any of this worked at all. In the law books of medieval Iceland, compiled from earlier oral custom into the written code known as gergs sometime in the 12th century, a specific unit of value appears again and again, used to price everything from land to livestock to compensation for injury, vammel, a length of coarse, plain woven wool cloth, standardised enough in width and quality that it functioned as a genuine form of currency in a society that, for long stretches of its early history, had no minted coinage of its own. This is the story of vammel, not a person, not a ship, but a fabric, and one so fundamental to how the Viking world actually functioned that it's fair to say the entire era, sailing included, simply doesn't happen without it. Everything this fabric eventually became, sail, cloak, blanket, currency, and the hide-lined sleeping sack that kept Kettle alive back in the very first chapter of tonight's story, started with sheep breeds specifically suited to the harsh, marginal grazing land much of Scandinavia and its North Atlantic colonies offered. Old Norse short-tailed sheep, ancestors of breeds still raised in Iceland, the Faroe Islands and parts of Scandinavia today, produce a distinctive double-layered fleece, a coarse water-shedding outer coat and a finer, warmer undercoat, a combination that gave Norse wool workers unusually versatile raw material to work with, depending on whether the finished cloth needed to prioritise warmth or weather resistance. Sheep were typically plucked rather than shorn in the earliest part of the era, a process called ruing that takes advantage of the fleece's natural seasonal shedding, before iron shears became widely available and made the process faster, if somewhat less gentle on the animal. Turning raw fleece into finished cloth was, without exaggeration, one of the most labour-intensive processes in the entire Norse economy, and it fell overwhelmingly to women's labour within the household, carding the fleece to align its fibres, spinning it into yarn using a handheld drop spindle, and finally weaving it on an upright, warp-weighted loom. A technology confirmed archaeologically by the discovery of loom weights at sites across the Norse world, including, as mentioned earlier tonight, among the grave goods buried alongside the Oseberg ship itself. Historians estimate that producing enough cloth for a single sail, a single Viking ship's sail, could require well over 100 square meters of woven wool, represented many months, potentially over a year, of concentrated household labour, meaning the sail carrying a crew across the North Atlantic literally represented more accumulated human work hours than the ship's construction itself. Here's the thing that tends to surprise people most about Viking Age seafaring. The ship gets all the glory, but the wool is very plausibly the more expensive, more labour-intensive achievement. What makes this specific wool genuinely remarkable, beyond the sheer labour invested in it, is a property you've heard referenced more than once tonight, without a full explanation of why it works. Unwashed wool retains a portion of its natural lanolin, a waxy water-repellent grease the sheep itself produces to shed rain and moisture from its own coat. Norse wool workers, whether or not they understood the underlying chemistry, clearly understood the practical result. And Viking Age cloth intended for sails, cloaks and outerwear was frequently left with much of that lanolin intact, sometimes even supplemented through additional treatment with fish oil or animal fat, producing a fabric with meaningfully better water resistance than fully scoured, degreased wool would offer. It's not waterproof in any modern technical sense. Nothing aboard Ketil's ship was ever fully dry for long, but it's the difference between cloth that sheds a portion of the rain and cloth that simply absorbs every drop that touches it, and on a night like the one you spent in this story's first chapter, that difference is not trivial. The fat deserves a closer look here too, now that you understand the broader wool economy it existed alongside. Constructed from cured animal hide, seal skin most commonly in coastal and island communities with reliable access to seal populations, though other hides saw use depending on region and availability, and sometimes lined with fleece for additional insulation. These sleeping sacks represented a genuine specialized investment distinct from ordinary bedding or clothing. Curing hide well enough that it remained supple, water-resistant and durable over years of hard use required real skill, typically involving a combination of scraping, stretching and treatment with animal fats or brains in a process called brain tanning, well documented across numerous cold climate cultures independently arriving at broadly similar solutions to the same basic problem. How do you make animal skin into something a human being can trust their survival to on a freezing night? Modern experimental archaeology has, in recent decades, put some of these claims to genuinely practical tests, rather than leaving them purely theoretical. Researchers and historical reenactment groups working with reconstructed Norse-era wool and hide gear, including participants in voyages like the Sea Stallion reconstruction mentioned earlier tonight, have generally reported that period-accurate wool clothing performs surprisingly well against cold and damp, compared to modern assumptions about primitive textile technology, even if it never fully matches the performance of contemporary synthetic and treated outdoor gear. The consistent finding across this kind of hands-on testing isn't that Viking Age sailors had secretly solved cold weather survival with better materials than we assume. It's that the materials they had, wool and hide specifically, were genuinely well suited to the job, used by people with generations of accumulated, practical knowledge about exactly how to maximize their performance, layering and care. This wool economy wasn't just functional, it was, as the Gruag's law code makes clear, genuinely foundational to how value itself was measured across much of the Norse world for centuries. A specific length of vamel of standardized quality, historians estimate roughly an L in width, an L being a unit of measurement based on forearm length that varied somewhat by region but generally corresponded to something close to 18 inches, could be used to price a cow, settle a debt, or pay compensation for an injury under the Wurjald system, referenced earlier in tonight's script. Functioning as what economic historians sometimes call commodity money, a currency whose value comes from genuine practical utility rather than any government's declaration. It's worth pausing on the strangeness of that for a moment. The same fabric wrapped around a freezing sailor's shoulders, stitched into a hide-lined sleeping sack, or cut and sewn into a ship's sail, was simultaneously functioning as the literal medium through which an entire society settled its debts and measured its wealth. Imagine paying your rent in the same material your winter coat is made from, and you're most of the way to understanding how deeply wool was woven, quite literally, into every layer of Norse economic and physical survival. That continuity didn't end when the Viking Age itself did. Icelandic sheep today remain genetically close to the animals Norse settlers first brought to the island in the 9th century, and the distinctive, still recognisable Icelandic wool sweater known as the lopapeysa, while a relatively modern design dating mainly to the 20th century draws directly on a wool tradition. Double-coated fleece, minimally processed, prized for exactly the water resistance and warmth Norse sailors relied on, that traces its practical lineage back without meaningful interruption to precisely the sheep and precisely the processing knowledge that kept people like Kettle, Starr, Halvard and Ref alive through their respective ordeals. Somewhere in a modern Reykjavik shop, a sweater is being sold today built from principles a Viking Age wool worker would recognise instantly, even if she'd have found the knitting technique itself unfamiliar. Colour mattered too, though mostly for those who could afford it. Most working wool, sailcloth, everyday clothing, the fat's fleece lining, was left in its natural undyed state, shades of cream, grey and brown depending on the sheep. Practical and cheap to produce. Dyed cloth represented a genuine luxury, achieved through labour-intensive plant-based processes, madder root imported from further south in Europe for red, woad for blue, and various lichens and local plants for a range of yellows and browns, all requiring additional processing time and expense, on top of the wool's already substantial labour cost. A crew member wrapped in undyed grey wool aboard Kettle's ship wasn't lacking in taste. He was simply spending his limited resources on quantity and quality of warmth rather than colour. A sensible priority for anyone whose wool cloak was doing genuine survival work rather than serving as a status display. And a reminder that the wool economy this chapter has been describing operated on a real, stratified scale, from the plainest, most practical working cloth up through cloth genuinely fine and vividly coloured enough to mark out a chieftain or a wealthy trader like Othere. The sheer scale of wool required to keep a single ship functioning is worth stating plainly, because the number tends to startle people used to thinking of clothing and sails as separate. Minor concerns from the ship itself. Historians and textile archaeologists working from reconstructed Viking-era weaving techniques estimate that producing enough wool cloth for a single ship's sail could require the fleece of roughly 200 sheep, processed across many months of concentrated spinning and weaving labour before a single thread ever touched a loom's frame. And that's before accounting for the separate wool needed for the crew's cloaks, sleeping gear, and everyday clothing aboard the same vessel. A functioning Viking Age ship, in other words, represented not just a shipwright's finished hull, but an entire ongoing agricultural and textile economy, standing behind it, flocks tended, fleece gathered, and countless hours of household labour converted into the specific woven material that let that hull actually go anywhere, and let its crew survive the going. When the modern reconstruction crew prepared the Sea Stallion from Glendalough for her 2007 voyage from Roskilde to Dublin, mentioned earlier tonight, the sail itself became a genuine research question in its own right. Not simply a prop, researchers and craftspeople worked to produce cloth using historically grounded weaving methods and wool sourced to approximate the qualities of Viking Age fleece as closely as modern flocks allow, aiming to test not just whether the hull could survive the crossing, but whether a period-accurate sail could actually drive it there. The resulting sail performed well enough to carry the reconstructed ship across genuinely rough North Atlantic water, offering modern researchers direct, hands-on confirmation of something this whole chapter has been arguing from archaeology and law codes alone, that Viking Age wool technology wasn't a primitive stopgap tolerated for lack of anything better. It was a genuinely sophisticated, carefully optimized material system, developed and refined over generations, fully capable of doing exactly the job it was built for. The sheer centrality of spinning to Norse women's economic and social identity left a mark on language itself, one that survived, largely unnoticed, into modern English. The word spinster, now an old-fashioned term for an unmarried woman, derives directly from exactly this labour. An unmarried woman in medieval Germanic and later English society was, quite literally and quite commonly, someone who spun wool for her living or her household's needs, since spinning was considered appropriate respectable work for women without a husband's household to otherwise occupy their labour. In Old Norse society specifically, the woman managing a household's textile production, often the Shreya, the lady of the house, held genuine economic authority and status tied directly to her control over exactly the wool economy this chapter has spent so long describing, her skill and output a measurable, valuable contribution to the household's wealth, not a decorative or purely domestic sideline. Every cloak, sail and fat this whole story has described existed because of that labour, specifically and disproportionately performed by women whose names, in the vast majority of cases, no source bothered to record, an imbalance worth naming plainly, even as we credit the material itself with everything it accomplished. Norse mythology, characteristically, found a way to elevate this exact domestic labour into something cosmic. The Norns, 3 fate-weaving female beings dwelling by the well at the base of the world tree, Yggdrasil, according to Edaic sources, were imagined as spinning, weaving, or otherwise shaping the threads of individual human destiny, determining the length and character of a person's life through an act directly modelled on the same spinning and weaving labour happening in every Norse household, night after night, by firelight. It's a striking thing to sit with. A culture that spent so much of its practical physical survival wrapped in wool also imagined its own fate, at the most cosmic level available to its mythology, has literally spun and woven into being by the same hands, doing the same work as every Shreya back home. Ketil's fat, stars singing over her children, Ref's worduled compensation, all of it, in some genuine cultural sense, threads of the same fabric this entire civilization believed governed its existence from the very beginning. Wool followed Norse people even past the end of their working lives, in a way that brings this chapter's themes full circle. Textile fragments recovered from numerous Norse burial sites, the Oseberg Mound among them, indicate that the dead were frequently wrapped or dressed in wool as part of burial preparation, sometimes in garments of notably finer quality than the deceased likely wore in ordinary daily life. A final, deliberate use of the same material that had spent a lifetime keeping that person warm through exactly the kind of nights this whole script has described. It's a small, quietly moving detail once you sit with it. The same coarse, practical cloth that kept Ketil alive on watch, that Star wrapped her children in, that bought Ref's family compensation under the Wurjald system, was also, ultimately, the material a Norse community chose to send its dead into whatever came next wrapped inside. Wool wasn't just survival technology in this culture. It was, in the most literal sense, present at both ends of a Norse life. The first warmth an infant knew, and very often, the last. There's a reasonable question worth asking directly, now that this chapter is nearly done. Why does any of this, the sheep breeds, the lanolin, the currency law codes, actually matter to understanding how Viking Age sailors slept? The answer is simply that it's the whole answer. Every single night described across this entire script, every crisis survived, and every quiet kindness extended between crewmates, depended on this fabric being available, well made, and properly used. Take the wool away, and Ketil's fat is just an ordinary hide bag offering minimal insulation. Take it away, and Star has nothing to wrap her frightened children in during a mid-Atlantic storm. Take it away, and Ref has no cloak thick enough to slow the frostbite that eventually costs him 2 toes. The ships get the glory in popular memory, the dragon prows, the striped sails, the raiding parties. But underneath every one of those dramatic images sits a much quieter, much less celebrated technology, spun by hand, one thread at a time, by women whose names mostly went unrecorded. And it did more to keep the entire Viking Age alive through its coldest nights than anything forged from iron ever did. It's worth taking a moment, too, to appreciate just how much specialised regional knowledge sat behind something as apparently simple as wool clothing across the whole Norse world. A cloak woven in Greenland working with the specific fleece of animals raised on that harsher, more marginal grazing land, differed meaningfully in weight, weave and finishing from cloth produced in the comparatively lusher pastures of western Norway or the volcanic grasslands of Iceland. Regional variation shaped by climate, available breeds, and generations of accumulated local expertise about exactly how to process that specific wool for maximum durability and warmth. A trader moving between these regions, the way O'Leary did on his southern routes, would have recognized these differences instantly, the way a modern buyer might recognize the difference between wool sourced from different countries or breeds today. None of it was accidental. It was the accumulated product of exactly the kind of practical, hard-won, generationally transmitted expertise that runs underneath every single chapter of tonight's story. Whether the subject was a ship's hull, a sailor's watch discipline, or the specific weave of the cloth keeping that sailor alive through the night. And it's worth one last acknowledgement, before this chapter closes for good. None of this. Not the sheep breeds, not the loom weights, not the standardised ell of Vamel changing hands as currency, survives in the popular imagination the way longships and raiding parties do, and that imbalance says something worth sitting with. The dramatic image endures, the quiet, essential labour behind it mostly doesn't, and mostly wasn't performed by the people the drama tends to centre on. Tonight's story has tried to correct that balance, at least a little, one wool-wrapped, half-frozen night at a time. Consider too that this entire economy, sheep, shears, spindle, loom, ship, operated on timescales that modern life rarely asks anyone to hold in their head at once. A Sfragi spinning wool by firelight in early spring might be producing thread destined for a sail that wouldn't actually go to sea until the following summer, on a voyage whose full outcome, success or failure, home or lost forever, she might not learn for the better part of a year after that. Patience, on a scale like that, wasn't a virtue this culture cultivated for its own sake. It was simply the operating tempo of an entire civilization built around wool, weather and water, and everyone living inside it, spinner and sailor alike, understood and accepted that rhythm as simply how the world worked. Patience, wool and time, three ordinary things. Doing extraordinary, unglamorous work, one long winter and one long voyage at a time. There's a final, quiet symmetry worth landing on before tonight's chapters close entirely. Go back for a moment to Kettle, alone on watch in the very first story you heard tonight, sharing half his sealskin fat with a hired hand named Skeggy somewhere in the cold, wet middle of a North Sea crossing. That single, unremarkable act of practical kindness, one sailor extending shelter to another, because a live crewmate mattered more than a slightly warmer half of a sleeping bag, sits at the exact centre of everything this chapter has been describing. The wool, the hide, the labour of the women who spun and wove it, the law codes that priced it, the sheep bred specifically to survive producing it, all of it, every layer of this entire technological and economic system, existed for the soul. Unglamorous purpose of getting people like Kettle and Skeggy through exactly the kind of night you spent with them at the very start of this story. It's easy to romanticize longships and raids and legendary voyages. It's much harder, and arguably far more honest, to recognize that what actually carried the Viking Age across 3 centuries of open water was something as ordinary, as unglamorous, and as quietly essential as a well-made blanket. Somewhere off a coastline with no name on any map, a young man named Kettle is still, in the version of this story that lives in your head now, counting oar strokes in sets of 100, touching his knife hilt once, and rolling his sealskin fat tight against a sea chest before another cold, wet night at sea. He never knew Star, or Halvard, or Ref, or Othere, or Leif, or the countless other Norse sailors whose nights blurred together across 3 centuries of exactly this kind of endurance. But every one of them was doing, on their own separate stretch of water or frozen shore, essentially the same thing he was, wrapping themselves in wool spun by hands whose names no one recorded. Trusting a hull built to flex rather than break, and lying down to sleep beside strangers who became, by simple necessity, the only thing standing between them and the cold. That's the real shape of this whole story. Once you strip away the ships and the sagas and the archaeology, not heroism exactly, and not tragedy either, but something quieter and somehow more remarkable than either. Ordinary human endurance, repeated so many times by so many people across so many freezing nights, that it eventually built an entire seafaring civilization stretching from Norway's fjords to the edge of North America. Nobody making that first crossing to Iceland thought they were making history. They were just trying to get warm enough to sleep, and then trying again the next night, and the night after that, for as long as the voyage demanded. You're warm right now, in a way none of them ever fully were. You're dry and still, and there's no watch to stand before dawn. That difference, the one this whole night has kept circling back to, is worth appreciating for exactly what it is. Not a small thing, and not something to take for granted, but a kind of quiet inheritance from every crew that ever lay down cold and got up anyway. Somewhere behind you, if you trace it back far enough, is a fat shared between two tired men, a mother singing to frightened children over the sound of a storm, an old man walking one more slow, careful circuit around a fire that isn't his to protect, but that he protects anyway. You're warm. You're safe, and somewhere out past the edge of everything they knew, they made it through the night. So that, eventually, quietly, you could too.